I rescinded my offer to bake cakes for my friend's wedding and may have ruined their relationship. I honestly don't know whether I am the villain in this story or just the easiest person to blame because I happened to be standing closest to the fire when everything finally caught. I'm Elise, I'm 32, I live in Ghent, and for the last 7 years, baking has been the one thing in my life that made me feel both calm and useful at the same time. I'm not a professional pastry chef in the legal, polished, fully insured sense of the word. I don't own a storefront with gold lettering on the window or an Instagram account with 12,000 followers and a ring light in my kitchen. I work part time doing bookkeeping for a transport company near the docks, and I bake out of love, obsession, grief, stubbornness, and occasionally for extra money when friends of friends want birthday cakes, christening biscuits, or tarts for retirement lunches. If someone asks what I do, I say accounts assistant. If someone asks what I actually care about, the answer is butter, sugar, temperature, timing, and the exact second a caramel crosses from amber into bitterness. I met Saskia when we were 19 and studying in Leuven. We were not the kind of best friends people envy from a distance. We weren't matching bracelets, late night tattoos, godmother to each other's children kind of friends. We were the kind of friends that form because one person is always running late and the other always has an extra pen, because one person cries in public without shame and the other knows how to steer that energy into a cafe with cheap coffee and indoor heating. She was loud, funny, magnetic, impossible to miss. I was the sort of person who disappears into wallpaper if no one says my name directly. Saskia liked that I listened. I liked that she filled silences before they became uncomfortable. Over time, the friendship settled into something familiar. We weren't inseparable, but we stayed in each other's lives through breakups, bad flats, underpaid jobs, family illnesses, and the humiliating years of pretending our 20s were going according to plan. She moved back to Bruges for a while, then to Antwerp, then finally to a village outside Mechelen with Ruben after they'd been together about 3 years. Ruben is 34, works in procurement for some industrial supplier, wears the same kind of neat coats every winter, and always looks like he has just apologized to someone in advance. The first time I met him, he brought wine and a plant when he and Saskia came to my flat for dinner. The plant was alive 2 years later. That alone told me something about him. They were, from the outside, one of those couples people describe as solid because they had practical furniture, a joint grocery list, and 2 holidays a year documented in clean little photo dumps. But even before they got engaged, I had seen the crack that ran quietly through them. Saskia loved intensity. She needed emotion to feel like proof of life. Ruben wanted steadiness, predictability, the sense that tomorrow would be basically manageable. She liked to talk things into the open until they were exhausted and overhandled. He liked to wait until feelings cooled down enough to stack neatly. Neither of those ways is automatically wrong, but together they made a strange friction. She experienced his calm as indifference. He experienced her urgency as a storm that arrived before he'd even had time to shut the windows. Still, when she called me crying after he proposed during a weekend in Bruges, I cried too. She said yes in front of the canal near Minnewater. In that dramatic, breathless way, she did everything. She rang me while she was still wearing the coat from the proposal photos, laughing and sobbing at the same time, and I remember sitting on the floor beside my oven because I had just pulled out 2 hazelnut sponges and didn't want them to collapse if I moved them too soon. Elise, she said, I'm getting married. I said, I know, you maniac. You're shouting so loudly people in Lille can probably hear you. She laughed, then started crying again, then said, will you do the cake? I should probably explain that this wasn't a shocking question. I had made cakes for smaller events before. I made the dessert table for my cousin's civil ceremony in Namur. I made a 3-tier lemon elderflower cake for a colleague's 40th birthday that somehow ended up on every WhatsApp group I've ever been unwillingly added to. Saskia had tasted almost everything I'd baked over the years. She used to say that my apple tart could repair a bad month. So when she asked, it felt less like a business arrangement and more like an extension of our history. A deeply inconvenient, labor-intensive, flour-dusted extension, but still. I asked how many guests. She said maybe 80, maybe 90, definitely under 100. I asked what kind of cake. She said something simple and elegant, maybe 3 tiers, maybe fresh flowers, maybe some extra tray bakes if I had the energy, but only if I wanted to. She stressed that last bit. Only if I wanted to. Then she said something that mattered more than I realized at the time. It would mean so much to me if it came from someone who loves me. That sentence did half the damage. The other half was done by my own need to be needed. My mother died 4 years ago. Even now, I still catch myself measuring time by whether something happened before or after the hospital. Before the hospital, I was more decisive. After the hospital, I became the kind of person who says yes to things because being useful feels like a temporary answer to grief. My mother taught me to bake. She never wrote recipes properly. She believed in, oh, until it smells right, and you'll know by the look of it, which drove me mad when I was younger and comforts me now in a way I can't explain without sounding like a tragic advert for salted butter. So when Saskia asked me to make her wedding cake, some stupid sentimental part of me heard not just her voice, but my mother's, and the whole thing became tangled in love, memory, and proving something to myself that no one had even asked for. I said yes. Not only yes, I said yes too fast. Yes with enthusiasm. Yes with a notebook already in my lap. Yes with suggestions about fillings and structure and transport. Yes with the cheerful martyrdom of someone who has not yet calculated the cost of eggs. At first, it was genuinely exciting. We met in Brussels one Saturday for coffee and cake tasting. I brought 6 sample boxes on the train, packed like crown jewels. Lemon elderflower, dark chocolate with sour cherry compote, pistachio and raspberry, vanilla bean with apricot, brown butter pear, coffee walnut. Saskia brought mood boards printed on thick paper, because of course she did, and Ruben showed up 15 minutes later with an apologetic expression and said he'd been circling for parking. That should have been the first warning sign, not because he was late. Because she was furious before he even sat down. She hissed, "I told you the reservation was at 1. He said very quietly, "It is 12:58. And it was. I remember because I looked at the clock while pretending not to. She stayed sharp with him for the first 20 minutes. Every time he liked a flavor, she would wrinkle her nose and say, "That's too heavy," or "That's too boring," or "No, that tastes like Christmas." Absolutely not. He wanted something classic. She wanted something editorial, which is a word I had previously associated with magazines and never with sponge cake. I kept trying to steer it back to practical things like guest count, dietary requirements, venue access, refrigeration, whether the ceremony and reception were in the same place. Ruben asked sensible questions. Saskia answered half of them and replaced the other half with fantasies. She wanted a cake that looked effortless but luxurious, romantic but modern, textured but clean, not rustic but not too polished. She wanted fruit but not visible fruit. She wanted flowers, but only if they looked curated. She wanted it to feel continental, which made Ruben stare at her in silence until I nearly laughed into my coffee. In the end, we settled on something achievable, a 3-tier cake for 90 guests, vanilla bean sponge, mascarpone cream, poached pear, thin layer of caramel, Swiss meringue buttercream, soft ivory finish, no fondant, decorated with seasonal flowers in muted tones. I would also make 2 sheet cakes in the same flavor to cut in the kitchen so the staff could serve generous portions without the display cake needing to feed an army. It was more work than I'd expected, but still possible. I told them I'd charge only for ingredients and transport because I wanted it to be my gift. Ruben immediately said that was too generous and they'd insist on paying more. Saskia squeezed my arm and said, "See why I love her." Now here is the detail that became important later. I said that to both of them, but I mostly said it to Saskia. Because after that tasting, everything began to slide, not all at once. Nothing dramatic enough that a sane person would slam on the brakes. Just tiny changes, each individually defensible, collectively ruinous. The guest list went from 90 to 110 because Ruben's aunt in Kortrijk was apparently offended not to be invited, and if she came then her sons had to come, and if her sons came then their partners had to come. Then Saskia's pilots group was invited to the evening part, and somehow that affected dessert numbers. Then the venue changed from a converted farmhouse near Mechelen to a manor outside Leuven because Saskia found photos of a staircase she loved. The new venue had stricter vendor rules. Then the color palette shifted from muted autumn to late Italian summer. Despite the wedding being in October in Belgium, where late Italian summer is really just code for cold rain on expensive shoes, she asked if I could add citrus details. Then maybe figs. Then maybe pipe borders because they were coming back. Then no pipe borders because they looked too vintage. Then she saw a 5 tier cake online and asked if I thought we could create that feeling without making it too big. She started referring to the cakes, plural, because she also wanted a smaller chocolate cake for Ruben's side since his family doesn't really do fruity desserts. I should have said no then. Or at least said, this is expanding beyond what I offered. Instead, I kept adapting. I redid sketches after work. I spent evenings pricing dowels and boards and transport boxes. I researched flower safety, because not every beautiful bloom belongs anywhere near food. I told myself brides get intense. I told myself wedding planning makes people weird. I told myself this would calm down once decisions were final. But decisions were never final with Saskia. Decisions were just stepping stones to newer, shinier decisions. The money started to make me uneasy by early spring. Butter was up. Eggs were up. Good vanilla had become nearly silly in price. Pears out of season were one thing. Beautiful pears that were consistent enough for a wedding cake were another. I sent her a revised estimate for ingredients and materials, still massively discounted, and she responded with a laughing voice note that said, "Don't faint, but we may need to keep this super lean because the florist, quote, made Ruben go pale." I thought she was joking. Then 2 weeks later, she sent me 6 photos of highly structured sugar flour cakes and asked if I could learn that. I said, "Those are specialist decorations. Saskia, that takes days." She said, "You always say that and then you somehow pull magic out of nowhere. It sounds complimentary written down like that, but the tone wasn't admiration. It was expectation." Around that same time, she started telling people that I was handling the whole dessert concept. I learned this accidentally at her engagement drinks in Antwerp when a woman I barely knew asked me whether I was also doing the gluten-free petit fours and the late-night cannoli station. I genuinely laughed because I assumed she was confused. She was not. She had heard it from Saskia. Later that evening, I took Saskia aside near the bar and said, "What exactly have you promised people I'm making?" She rolled her eyes in the way she does when she thinks someone is being needlessly technical. "Nothing insane," she said. "Just some small additions. It sounds nicer if I say you're curating dessert." "I'm not curating dessert." "Lice." "No, really, I'm not. We agreed cake and 2 kitchen cakes. That's already a lot." She leaned against the wall, drink in hand, looking more tired than angry. "I know. But if we get manis and biscuits elsewhere, it won't match. And honestly, the caterer's dessert options are tragic. Then let the caterer do tragic tiramisu in glasses," I said. "That has nothing to do with me." She laughed at that, but she didn't actually back off. What made it harder was that sometimes she would switch right back into being my friend. She'd come to Ghent and spend Sunday afternoon at my flat eating soup and talking about her father's blood pressure or Ruben's inability to buy a lamp without needing 3 days of comparison research. She'd help wash mixing bowls. She'd sit on the counter in thick socks and tell me I was her safe person, her sane person, the only one who didn't make her feel like she was too much. Then, 48 hours later, she'd send me an 11-photo album of cakes from Copenhagen or Florence or some Chair 2 wedding in Provence and ask whether I could just elevate things a little. The first major crack came over the tasting dinner. Her venue required a final vendor meeting in person. I was never a vendor in the official sense, which should have told all of us something, but Saskia insisted I come because who's easier if everyone hears the same information. So I took a day off work, traveled to Leuven, and sat in a high-ceilinged room with the venue coordinator Saskia, Ruben, the florist, the photographer, and a caterer who looked like he drank only espresso, and disappointment. The coordinator, a woman named Claire with impossibly smooth hair, asked each supplier to confirm insurance and delivery windows. When it came to me, I began to explain that I was making the cake as a private arrangement and would deliver it personally. Claire smiled that professional smile, which is really just bureaucracy and lipstick. "I'm sorry," she said, "but all external food providers need proof of registration, allergen documentation, and liability cover." I looked at Saskia. She looked at me with the expression of someone who wants a problem to disappear by refusing to acknowledge it. Ruben frowned and said, What do you mean registration?" Claire repeated herself, very politely. Very clearly, I said, "I'm not a commercial bakery. I'm making the cake as a gift," and then Ruben said something that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. "A gift? I thought we were paying you." He wasn't angry when he said it, just confused. My whole body went cold in that specific way where you realize several conversations have happened around you without you. Saskia jumped in immediately. We are paying ingredients? Ruben turned to her. I thought we were paying for the cake? We discussed it? No, you told me you'd arranged it. Claire, sensing human disaster, began shuffling papers with the speed of someone trying to turn invisible. The florist stared at her own lap. The photographer suddenly found a ceiling beam fascinating. I wanted the floor to split open. I said, carefully, I told both of you I'd only charge ingredients and transport. Ruben looked at me, then at Saskia. I never saw any final amount. It wasn't final because things kept changing. I said before I could stop myself. Saskia snapped her head toward me. That meeting never recovered. Claire suggested that if the cake entered through the venue kitchen, rules applied. If it arrived already plated by the caterer, there might be other possibilities. The caterer objected immediately. He wanted no responsibility for external dessert items without documentation. Ruben grew quieter and quieter in that way that meant he was not calming down, merely storing it. Saskia's smile became dangerous. As soon as we were outside in the gravel drive, she rounded on me. Why would you say that in there? I laughed because I genuinely thought she couldn't be serious. Why would I say what? The truth. You blindsided me. I blindsided you. You didn't tell the venue I'm not a registered vendor? I assumed we'd work around it. You assumed wrong. Ruben stood a few feet away, hands in coat pockets, watching us the way people watch a pan on the stove when they're not sure if it's already burning. Then he said quietly, Did you tell me Elise had quoted labor as well? Saskia said, Can we not do this in the car park? He said, That's not an answer. And she said, Because every time we talk about money, you act like I'm setting the house on fire. That was when I stepped back. Physically, like there might be debris. On the drive home, she sent me a long message saying she was sorry for the stress, that venue rules were ridiculous, that she'd sort it, and that the important thing was not to let admin nonsense spoil the joy of the wedding. Ruben sent me a separate message apologizing for the awkwardness and asking whether I could send him the actual estimate directly, just so I understand the logistics. That wording mattered. Understand the logistics. So measured. So unlike Saskia's usual emotional fog machine, I sent it to him. Not to expose her, not to cause trouble, simply because he asked, and because by then I was becoming frightened of how much had apparently been implied on my behalf. The estimate was not outrageous, but it was far higher than the small ingredients only gesture she had probably described. Once you include boards, boxes, supports, flowers, transport, backup supplies, and the cost of producing extra servings, even charity has a receipt attached. He replied, Thank you. I didn't realize the scope. That was it. 3 days later, Saskia called me in tears and said Ruben had become obsessed with spreadsheets and was questioning every wedding decision. She said he was acting betrayed, which she thought was melodramatic because everyone knows wedding budgets shift. She said he had accused her of minimizing costs because she knew he would say no. She said I didn't understand the pressure she was under from both families. Then she said the sentence that lodged under my skin like a splinter. If you had just been less literal for 5 minutes, we wouldn't be here. Less literal. As if honesty were some fussy habit of mine, like preferring real vanilla. I should have stopped then. I know that. Looking back, I think the only reason I didn't is because I still believed disaster could be contained if I worked harder, stayed calmer, and absorbed more of the strain. Some people have a savior complex, mine wears an apron. Summer made everything worse. The wedding was in October, but July and August were when Saskia entered full production mode. Every conversation became about aesthetics, seating politics, menu tensions, whose mother said whether the bridesmaids' dresses photographed dusty blue or medical, she was sleeping badly. Ruben was being impossible. Her mother Ingrid was apparently taking over parts of the ceremony. Ruben's sister Clara had opinions on everything and expressed them like subpoenas. The florist had raised prices. The photographer wanted a stricter timeline. The manor required final counts earlier than expected, and through all of this, the cake kept morphing like an over-designed fever dream. One weekend, she came to Ghent with a mood board so different from our original plan that I thought at first she was joking. The soft ivory finish was gone. Now she wanted sharp edges. Now she wanted bows, real bows made of sugar paste. She wanted one tier flavored with blood orange, though oranges were barely relevant to anything seasonal or local. She wanted piped Lambeth details, but minimal. She wanted tiny piers glazed to look lacquered. She wanted a darker chocolate cake for Ruben's side, but separate enough to feel intentional, not like the boring groom cake. She also wanted 80 hand-painted biscuits as escort cards because she'd seen something similar in a wedding magazine and thought it was such a cute, edible moment. I stared at her across my kitchen table for a long time. Saskia, I said, this is not the same job. She sighed like a woman burdened by someone else's lack of imagination. Weddings evolve, not into 6 separate projects. You always make it sound dramatic. Because it is dramatic. I have a job and I have a wedding. I know this sounds like a line from a bad film, but that is exactly what she said. Flat, irritated, incredulous that I would compare her central life event with my ordinary employment and existing responsibilities. I asked her whether she had spoken to a professional bakery about what she was now asking for. She said she didn't need to because she had me. The thing about entitlement is that it rarely arrives as a villainous speech. Usually it arrives wearing intimacy. It sounds like trust. It sounds like closeness. It sounds like, I knew you'd understand. It sounds like, you're the only one I can rely on. It takes your affection and uses it as leverage until you can no longer tell where kindness ends and extraction begins. By late August, I was exhausted. Not physically at first, though that came too. Emotionally. Every time my phone lit up with her name, I felt a small anticipatory dread. I started postponing my own plans because she just needed 10 minutes. That somehow turned into an hour and a half of me talking her down from some wedding-adjacent panic. Matteo, the man I'd been seeing on and off for a year, finally said one night, I don't think you're her friend anymore. I think you're unpaid event infrastructure. I told him that was unfair. He said, Is it? I hated that question because I already knew the answer. Matteo is from Turin, lives in Ghent now, teaches secondary school history, and possesses the deeply inconvenient habit of noticing truths I am trying to ignore. He had met Saskia twice and never disliked her exactly, but he disliked the version of me that emerged after spending time with her lately, apologetic, twitchy, depleted, and somehow defensive on behalf of the very person causing the depletion. He once described her as a woman who mistakes urgency for importance, and I didn't speak to him for most of that evening. Then came the dinner in Mechelen. It was supposed to be casual. Just me, Saskia, Ruben, Clara, and Ingrid at Saskia and Ruben's house, going over a few final details. I brought a tart because I am apparently constitutionally incapable of showing up empty-handed even to my own slow destruction. The evening started tense and stayed there. Clara had opinions about portion size. Ingrid thought buttercream was too rich for older guests. Ruben was trying to keep the conversation on timing and delivery. Saskia kept derailing it into visuals. At one point, Clara asked whether I had a backup refrigeration plan, and I said I was still waiting on confirmation from the venue regarding kitchen access because of the registration issue. Silence. Clara looked at Saskia. Ingrid looked at Ruben. Ruben put his fork down. What do you mean, still waiting? He asked. Saskia said, because they keep making it a thing. Ruben said, it is a thing. Ingrid, who has the sharp, elegant cruelty of women who believe manners excuse content, said, I did wonder whether this had become a bit ambitious for a home arrangement. Home arrangement. I smiled the way people smile when they are imagining murder only abstractly. Saskia immediately bristled and said, Elise is more talented than half the overpriced bakers in Brussels. And if she had stopped there, maybe I would have let it pass. But then she laughed and added, she just collapses under admin. There are humiliations that happen in private, and then there are humiliations performed socially where everyone has the opportunity to either rescue you or let you sit in it. No one rescued me. Ruben looked uncomfortable. Clara sipped wine. Ingrid actually smiled. I said, I don't collapse under admin. I just wasn't told half the admin existed. Saskia rolled her eyes. There you go again. Something in me snapped, not explosively, but cleanly, like a thread pulled too tight finally giving way. I put my fork down and said, I need to be very clear. I agreed to make a wedding cake for a friend. I did not agree to become your bakery, your planner, your cost absorber, your crisis line, and your excuse when things don't add up. The table went still. Saskia stared at me as if I had broken some sacred rule of performance by refusing my role. Ruben said my name softly, as if trying to de-escalate, but I was beyond de-escalation. I kept going. I said the job had doubled, then tripled. I said the venue problem was not a clerical accident, but a direct result of her pretending my favor was a professional service when it suited her. I said I was tired of being told I was making things dramatic when all I was doing was naming them. I said I had already spent more time, money, and emotional energy on this wedding than I was comfortable admitting even to myself. Saskia's face changed while I spoke. First indignation, then disbelief, then that particular wounded fury people wear when someone they counted on suddenly stops being convenient. She said, "So, what, now you're keeping score?" And I said, "No, I'm finally reading it." I left 20 minutes later with most of my tart still on the plate. She called 9 times that night. I didn't answer. The next morning, she sent a message long enough to qualify as a novella. It accused me of attacking her in front of her future family, of deliberately shaming her, of choosing the most vulnerable moment to make everything about myself. She said she had defended me endlessly to people who already thought using me was risky. She said I was letting my personal stress poison the wedding. She said real friends rise to occasions like this instead of auditing them. That last word, auditing, as if because I worked in accounts, my problem was not being used but being too attentive to numbers. I rate it 3 times, then set the phone down and went to work. I entered freight invoices for 4 hours with such violent concentration that my manager asked whether I was developing a migraine. At lunch, Ruben called. I stepped outside the office and answered because ignoring him felt childish, and because some part of me still believed adults could salvage truth from mess if they spoke carefully enough. He sounded exhausted. He apologized for the dinner. He said he should have stepped in sooner. He said he didn't think Saskia understood how much she had piled onto me. Then he said, after a pause, "I need to ask you something, and I'd prefer a painful truth to a polite one." That sentence alone told me his relationship was in deeper trouble than cake. He asked me whether, in my honest view, the wedding had become impossible to execute the way Saskia described it, not emotionally impossible. Logistically, financially, practically. He said he was being told by Saskia that he was overreacting, and by Ingrid that all brides behave like this, and by Clara that if there were hidden costs now, there would be more later. He wanted to know whether this was just normal wedding chaos or whether he was looking at something more serious. I said very slowly that normal wedding chaos doesn't usually involve one person consistently minimizing costs, changing scope without agreement, and assuming unpaid labor from friends will stretch infinitely under pressure. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "If you were me, would you trust the rest of the planning?" That was the moment I wished I had never baked a single sponge in my life, because I understood what he was really asking, not about cake, about her. I said, "I think you need to separate the wedding from the pattern." He said, "That's what I'm afraid of." We ended the call politely, too politely, like people standing in the rubble of something neither of them is sure how to name. The next week was the worst. Saskia stopped speaking to me directly and started speaking about me through other people. Clara sent a clipped message asking whether I was still in or out, because alternatives needed booking. Ingrid sent something even colder, thanking me for my initial enthusiasm and suggesting it might be best for all involved if the family pursued a more reliable supplier. One mutual friend from university, Freyja, rang me purely to gossip and then pretended it was concern. Apparently Saskia was telling people I had become jealous of the wedding, resentful of her happiness, and erratic because my personal life was unstable. That last part was particularly creative, considering the instability in question consisted of me working regular hours, paying my rent on time, and occasionally forgetting to text Matteo back when Saskia was taking up all the oxygen in the room. I nearly caved. That is the part I'm least proud of. There were 2 full days where I considered apologizing just to end the noise. I thought maybe I could strip the project back to the original design, muscle through, deliver the cake, and then quietly let the friendship die afterward. That would have been cleaner, more elegant, less damaging. But then Saskia sent the message that made the decision for me. It arrived at 23:47 on a Thursday night, no greeting. No attempt at repair. Just 6 bullet points. She had decided the cake needed to be taller for visual balance in the reception room. She wanted fresh pears replaced with fig because pears now felt too provincial. She wanted hand-piped bows on the second tier. She wanted the chocolate cake incorporated into the main display rather than served separately. She wanted the kitchen cakes to be cut into smaller portions so more guests could try multiple sweets. And she wanted confirmation by morning because she was finalizing print materials. I stared at that message until I laughed out loud. Actually laughed. alone in my kitchen in socks next to a sink full of bowls. Then I wrote back, I'm no longer able to make your wedding cakes. You'll need to book a professional bakery. I wish you both the best. That was it. No speech. No justifications. No fresh ammunition. She called instantly. I didn't answer. She called again. Then sent, Are you serious? Then, Halase, this is insane. Then, you can't do this 6 weeks before the wedding. Then, do you understand what this will cost us? Then, my personal favorite, Ruben is already furious. Are you actually trying to ruin my life? There it was. The truth she'd been circling all along. Not are you okay? Not can we talk? Not I'm sorry this got so bad. Just cost and consequence and blame. I didn't reply. The next day, Ruben sent a very different message. He said he understood. He said he was sorry things had reached that point. He asked whether I could forward any sketches, flavor notes, or structural details to whichever bakery they ended up hiring because it might help them salvage something close to the original idea. That message nearly made me cry because it was the first reasonable thing anyone had said in weeks. I forwarded everything. 3 days later, Freja told me, with the breathless thrill of a woman delivering disaster she had not suffered herself, that Saskia and Ruben had had a massive fight over the cake, the florist, and several other wedding bills Ruben apparently had not seen in full. According to Freja, who heard it from Clara, who probably heard it through a wall, Ruben had asked Saskia what else he didn't know about. Saskia had said he was humiliating her. Ruben had said this wasn't about humiliation, it was about trust. Saskia had accused him of making her feel like a criminal over details. He had apparently replied that hidden money and hidden decisions are not details when you are about to get married. I want to be very clear here. I did not set out to expose her. I did not withdraw the cakes as some strategic punishment. I withdrew because I had reached the end of what I could do without feeling like I was consenting to my own erasure. But I would be lying if I said I didn't understand why the withdrawal hit their relationship so hard. The cakes were one of the last wedding elements still being held together by friendship, improvisation, and my willingness to overfunction. Once I stepped back, the actual weight of everything became visible. And it wasn't just the cakes. That is what people keep missing when they say I caused this. The cakes were a pressure point. Pull one badly fitted tile from a roof and people act like the storm is your fault, when really the water was already inside the house. What I later learned, mostly through the ugly grapevine of mutual connections, was that my estimate wasn't the only number Saskia had softened when speaking to Ruben. She had also downplayed the florist increase, the dress alterations, the cost of extending the reception, and some custom stationery she'd ordered from a designer in Paris. None of these things alone were catastrophic. Together they painted a picture of someone who kept deciding first and disclosing later, assuming love would absorb the difference. Ruben, from what I understand, did not care only about the money. He cared that she seemed more afraid of hearing no than of being dishonest. And I think that is the part that frightened him most, because marriage is full of boring little no's. No, we can't afford that this month. No, we can't promise Christmas to both families. No, we can't move cities just because one of us feels restless. If someone treats no like an insult, every ordinary compromise becomes a wound. The social fallout landed on me anyway. For several weeks, I was the friend who dropped out. People who barely knew the situation talked about reliability and timing as if I had abandoned a child at a motorway service station instead of refusing unpaid quaz, commercial labor under manipulative conditions. One of Saskia's cousins wrote a nasty comment under an old Instagram photo of a cake I'd made, saying, wouldn't trust her with a cupcake. I deleted it and then cried so hard I gave myself a headache. Matteo came over with olives, bread, and the kind of silence that counts as care. He did not say I told you so. Instead he said, you did something very difficult. That doesn't mean it was wrong. The thing is, guilt is not a reliable moral compass. Sometimes you feel guilty because you've harmed someone. Sometimes you feel guilty because you stopped performing a role they benefited from. I knew that intellectually. Emotionally, it was harder. I kept replaying timelines in my head. If I had pulled out earlier, would they have had more options? If I had stayed softer at the dinner, would the fight with Ruben have been smaller? If I had refused the first expansion, would none of this have spiraled? There were 100 off ramps and I had missed most of them. But missing earlier boundaries does not mean you lose the right to draw a later one. About a month before the wedding, Saskia showed up at my flat unannounced. That was the first time I'd seen her in person since the dinner in Mechelen. She looked thinner, paler, and furious in a way that had gone beyond heat into something glacial. She was wearing a camel coat and no lipstick, which on her was practically a distress signal. I almost didn't let her in. But she looked on the verge of either crying or shouting in the hallway, and my downstairs neighbor already hates everyone, so I stepped aside. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of my kitchen, the same kitchen where we had once spent whole evenings testing fillings and laughing about disastrous dates, and said, "Are you happy?" I said, "No." That seemed to throw her for a second. Maybe she expected defensiveness. Maybe she expected a speech. She said, "Because this has destroyed everything." I asked what this meant. She laughed, sharp as broken glass. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you're detached. Ever since you bailed, Ruben has been acting like I'm some kind of liar. He cross-checks everything. Every invoice. Every decision. Every conversation. My mother is furious. Clara thinks I'm irresponsible. The bakery we had to hire cost nearly triple your estimate. And now Ruben keeps asking whether I bullied you, which is honestly insane. I could have answered a dozen different ways. I could have said he was not insane. I could have said people generally don't ask that question unless something about the situation already looks bad from the outside. I could have said she was still talking about money before she was talking about friendship. Instead, I said, "Why are you here, Saskia?" She stared at me, and for the first time since all of this began, I thought I saw something underneath the anger. Not softness exactly, more like terror. Then she said very quietly, "Because I need to know whether you told him other things." I genuinely frowned. Other things about me. And there it was. Not grief for the friendship, not regret, fear of exposure, I said. I answered what he asked me about the cake. Her jaw tightened. "So yes, I did not sit him down and diagnose your soul, if that's what you mean. You always do this holier than thou thing where you make facts sound neutral." That sentence has stayed with me because it's one of the strangest accusations I've ever received. Make facts sound neutral, as if facts are supposed to arrive adorned with loyalty. I said, "If the truth feels hostile, maybe that's not because I sharpened it." She started crying then, suddenly and violently, as if some internal wire had burned through. She sat down hard on one of my kitchen chairs and covered her face. I stood there frozen because despite everything, my instinct when she cried had always been to comfort first and analyze later. Years of muscle memory don't disappear on command, she said through her hands. I just wanted one thing to be beautiful. I believed her. That was the worst part. I believed her completely. I believed she wanted the wedding to feel like proof that all the messier parts of adulthood had resolved into something enviable and coherent. I believe she wanted beauty badly enough that reality started to feel like sabotage. I believe each compromise felt to her like diminishment, and each omission like a temporary bridge she could justify later. I believe she did not wake up plotting to manipulate everyone around her. I think she simply kept choosing the version of events that preserved momentum until momentum became deception. But understanding someone is not the same as volunteering to be crushed beneath their need. So I did not take my decision back. I made tea. She didn't drink it. She cried, then got angry again, then cried once more. She said I had abandoned her at the worst moment of her life. I said the worst moment of her life should not have depended on my unpaid labor to remain stable. She said I was being cruel. I said maybe, but only after being accommodating for far too long. She asked whether I even cared that the wedding might not happen. I said if the wedding could be derailed by one friend refusing to make cake, then cake was not the real issue. She left without finishing the tea. A week later, I heard they had postponed final payment to the venue. Then I heard they were working through things. Then I heard nothing for several days, which somehow felt louder than gossip. Freyja, who should honestly invoice people for the amount of second-hand chaos she distributes, sent me, not sure if it's true, but they may be doing counseling before the wedding. I didn't ask for confirmation. Part of becoming an adult, I'm learning very late, is recognizing when you are no longer entitled to front row access to a story just because you once played a central role in it. As of now, the wedding is still technically happening, or it was last I heard. I have not been re-invited, which I was not expecting, and I am not making the cakes, which still causes me equal parts relief and shame depending on the hour. Sometimes I imagine the hired bakery delivering something flawless and towering and expensive, and everyone saying, "See, This is what should have happened all along. Sometimes I imagine the cake leaning slightly under the venue lights and Saskia staring at it as if a perfect exterior could still save what had already cracked. Sometimes I imagine Ruben standing in a suit in one of those manor house rooms, wondering whether the person beside him is the person he can trust when life becomes less photogenic than vows and flowers. And yes, I know how self-important that sounds, as if I think I'm some hinge on which their future turned. I don't. Not really, but I do think small incidents reveal larger truths when pressure is high enough. The cake mattered because it exposed patterns. Her pattern of assuming love could cover what honesty had not. My pattern of overgiving until resentment made me unrecognizable to myself. Ruben's pattern of staying calm until calm became distance, then suddenly becoming forensic when he felt something foundational had been hidden. All of us were more ourselves than usual because weddings don't create character, they magnify it. If I am honest, the thing I grieve most is not the friendship itself, though I do grieve that too. It is the version of it I kept trying to save long after it had quietly transformed into something conditional. I miss the girl who sat in student cafeterias with me in Leuven and made me laugh so hard coffee came out of my nose. I miss the woman who once took a train to Ghent just because I texted that I couldn't stop crying on the anniversary of my mother's death. I miss the simplicity of believing that being needed meant being loved. Maybe that is why this whole thing has hit me so hard. Because it wasn't only a wedding favor, it was a referendum on a friendship I had been protecting with nostalgia long after the present stopped supporting it. And still, even now, I have moments where I wonder if I should have just made the damned cakes. I picture the tiers in my mind. Vanilla bean sponge, mascarpone cream, pear, caramel, buttercream smoothed in careful upward passes, flowers placed at the last second so nothing bruises. I know exactly how I would have stacked them. I know how I would have checked each dowel twice, then stood back and adjusted one bloom by a centimeter because symmetry is not the same as balance. I know I would have delivered them with my chest tight and my hands shaking, and then smiled for photographs I would later avoid looking at, and maybe everyone would have called me generous. But generosity that breeds resentment is just delayed self-betrayal with nice lighting. So that is where things stand. I said yes because I loved my friend. I said no because somewhere between the changing guest counts and hidden costs and public belittling and midnight demands, loving my friend had started requiring that I disappear. I refused. And when I did, the pressure that had been held in place by my refusal to object shifted back where it belonged. Maybe I ruined their relationship, or maybe their relationship was already being ruined by every truth that had been postponed until a cake became the first thing that could no longer carry the weight. Story 2. After 8 years of verbal begging, I 27F resorted to writing a note. Gave it to husband 28M on Monday, and he hasn't talked to me since. I think that means marriage is over and I should leave. He says I'm never happy and being overreacting. I know the title sounds dramatic, which is kind of ironic because dramatic is my husband's favorite word for me. If I cry, I'm dramatic. If I ask a follow-up question, I'm interrogating him. If I say something hurt my feelings, I'm doing the thing again where I turn everything into a crisis. I'm 27. He's 28. We've been together since I was 19 and he was 20, married for 3 years. So when I say I've spent 8 years begging, I don't mean begging for flowers or date nights or some movie version of romance. I mean I've spent 8 years begging for basic, humiliatingly small things. Please don't mock me in front of your friends. Please stop telling me I'm too sensitive every time I'm upset. Please don't walk out of the room when I'm talking. Please don't tell your mother private things I said during arguments. Please don't make me feel stupid for caring. Please answer me like I'm your wife, not some annoying customer you're trying to get off the phone. At first, it wasn't constant, which is probably why I stayed. Early on, he was funny and warm and good at reading people. He knew exactly how to make any room like him. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, bring me coffee when I studied, tell me I was the only person who really got him, and when he did something mean, it always had an explanation attached to it. He was stressed. He was tired. He didn't mean it like that. I took it wrong. He joked because that's how he grew up. His family is just blunt. Over time, blunt turned into cruel, and joking turned into this weird thing where I'd be standing there, trying not to cry, while he looked at me like my reaction was the actual offense. A stupid example. Last month we were at his cousin's cookout and someone asked when we were planning to have kids. I said I wasn't sure yet because my work schedule at the imaging clinic has been insane. Before I could even finish, my husband laughed and said, she needs a full board meeting, a 5-year plan, and emotional support from the moon before she can buy dish soap, so don't hold your breath. Everyone laughed. Even his aunt almost choked on her drink. I smiled because what else do you do when 10 people are looking at you? On the drive home, I told him that was humiliating, and he said, "Oh my God, you can't survive one joke. This is why I can't talk to you. Everything is a wound." That sentence lives in my body now. This is why I can't talk to you. As if my pain causes his cruelty. For the last year especially, I've felt like I've been disappearing inside this marriage. I work full time. I handle almost all of the bills because I'm the one who remembers due dates. I do groceries, laundry, school forms for his little sister when his mom dumps stuff on us, gift shopping for his family, vet appointments for the dog he wanted, all of it. And somehow I'm still cast as the unhappy one because I keep noticing I'm carrying the whole relationship on my back. The last fight before the note was on Sunday night. It started over money, which it always does lately. We've been trying to save because our building manager hinted the rent is going up again this summer. We had a separate savings account we called the buffer account, which was basically our emergency fund. I checked it Sunday because I wanted to see whether we could afford to replace my car tires this month. There was almost $4,000 missing. When I asked him about it, he didn't even look embarrassed. He was standing at the kitchen sink eating cereal dry from the box, like I'd asked whether we had more paper towels. He said, "I moved some stuff around." I said, "What stuff?" He said, "Money." I said, "I can see that." Then he got that look, that flat, bored look that tells me he's already decided I'm ridiculous. He said it went to family stuff. I asked whose family. He said mine, obviously. Like I should have known. Like the answer made me stupid. I asked how much, for what, and why he didn't tell me before moving shared money, and he literally sighed and said, "Because whenever I try to do anything, you make it into this giant, exhausting moral trial." I asked if it went to his mother. He said, "You always want a villain." Then he left the room. That was it. That was the whole marriage in one scene. Me asking not even for permission, just information. Him making me feel insane for asking. Then him physically leaving before I could finish a sentence. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't chase him like I usually do. I just sat at the kitchen table and realized I have started editing myself before I speak because I'm so used to him reacting like communication itself is abuse. So Monday morning, before work, I wrote him a note. Not because I'm childish. Honestly, because I am exhausted. Every time I try to talk, he interrupts or smirks or wanders off or turns it into a performance about how impossible I am. I thought if I wrote it down, he couldn't twist my tone. He couldn't say I yelled when I didn't. He couldn't derail me after sentence 2. The note was 2 pages, handwritten. I said I loved him, but I could not keep living in a marriage where my feelings were treated like defects. I said I was done being mocked, dismissed, and shut out. I said taking money without talking to me was not family helping family, it was a betrayal. I said I wanted counseling, full transparency about money, and a serious conversation by the end of the week. I even wrote word for word, I am not asking for perfection. I am asking for basic respect. I folded it, put it next to his keys, and texted him that I'd left something important for him to read. He read it. I know he did because when I got home that night, the note was gone. And since then, nothing. Not full nothing, which I almost think would hurt less. He's doing this thing where he speaks around me but not to me. He'll ask the dog if she wants to go outside while standing 2 feet from me. He'll call his brother in the living room and laugh extra loud. He'll open the fridge, mutter unbelievable, and close it like he's starring in a commercial for male suffering. The only direct thing he said to me since Monday was Tuesday night when I finally asked, "Are you seriously not going to respond to what I wrote?" He shrugged and said, "What response do you want? You're never happy. If I say anything, you'll find a reason it's wrong. I'm not doing this performance with you." I said, "A performance." I said, "I'm drowning." He actually rolled his eyes. See, that normal people don't describe everything like a tragedy. I don't even remember what I said after that. I think my body left before my brain did. I went into the bathroom, sat on the closed toilet, and stared at the tiles so hard it started to blur. I keep circling the same question. If a man can read 2 pages from his wife, basically saying, "I don't think our marriage can survive this," and his response is silence, contempt, And a line about how I'm never happy isn't that the answer. Like, what am I staying for? Another 5 years of begging to be spoken to like a person. The part that makes me feel stupid is that I still keep waiting for him to come in and say, I've been awful. I didn't realize how bad it got. Let's fix it. Some pathetic part of me is still standing at the door like a dog hearing a car outside. But tonight something happened that made my stomach drop. We have one old tablet we both use for streaming because mine broke. He left it on the couch, and an email notification popped up while I was looking for a recipe. I wasn't snooping, I literally just saw the subject line. Final notice before default. At first I thought it was spam. Then I saw his name. Then I saw an attachment from the bank. I didn't open it yet. My hands started shaking so badly I had to put the tablet down. So now I'm sitting in my car in the parking lot outside our building, typing this, and I feel like that note might not have ended my marriage. It might have interrupted whatever lie I'm only just starting to see. Update 1. I opened the email. I wish I hadn't been right, but I was. The final notice before default was about his truck. For context, my husband has a black pickup he is weirdly obsessed with. It's not some work necessity. He doesn't haul equipment. He doesn't need it for his job. He just likes it because it makes him feel like a man in a truck commercial. He always says it's his one thing, which would be fine if his one thing wasn't financed like a bad decision and maintained like a shrine. I knew he was behind on one payment last year because he blamed some payroll glitch. What I didn't know is that he's apparently been behind for a lot longer than that, and the bank was threatening repossession. So I did what I should have done months ago. I started looking at everything. Not just the tablet, the bank app, the drawer where we keep paperwork, the email folders. I was shaking the whole time, like I was about to get caught doing something wrong in my own life. Here's what I found. The nearly $4,000 missing from our emergency savings didn't go to family stuff in the vague, abstract way he made it sound. It went to his mother. Multiple transfers. Different amounts. One had truck permit in the memo. Another said deposit. Another just said for now. I had no idea what that meant, so I kept digging. Then I found LLC paperwork. My husband and his mother are trying to open a food truck. And before anyone says this is exciting or entrepreneurial or something, let me be clear, this was not a dream he shared with me. This was not a plan we discussed. This was not some surprise opportunity. This was a secret project funded partly with money taken from our account while he acted like I was controlling for wanting to know where our savings went. And that still wasn't the worst part. The reason he's been weirdly unavailable, leaving at odd hours, coming home smelling like fryer oil and acting irritated whenever I asked how work was. He hasn't had his actual job for almost 2 months. He quit, or maybe got pushed out, I don't know yet, but he definitely has not been working at the event company where I thought he still worked. I found a resignation email chain buried in his inbox, dated 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. For nearly 2 months, this man has been getting dressed in the morning, leaving our apartment, letting me kiss him goodbye, and pretending to go to work while I picked up extra shifts because he kept saying we needed to be smarter financially. I genuinely think my brain protected me for a minute because I just sat there staring at the screen with no thoughts. Then all at once I got hit with every conversation from the last 2 months. Me saying I was tired, him saying we all are, me asking why he was grumpy, him saying work was brutal, me paying the electric bill because his paycheck was late, me apologizing after asking too many questions because I didn't want to be that wife. I started crying so hard I threw up in the kitchen sink. He came home while I was wiping my face with a dish towel. I had all the papers spread across the table. He stopped in the doorway and just looked at me. Not shocked, not guilty, annoyed. Like I'd found his birthday present early and ruined the mood. I said, "You quit your job?" He dropped his keys in the bowl and said, "Lower your voice." That was his first instinct. Not explanation, not apology. Tone management. I said louder, "You quit your job and took money from our savings and gave it to your mother." He rubbed his forehead and said, "Can you not do this right now?" I laughed, but in that horrible way where it sounds like choking. "Do what?" "Find out my husband has been lying to my face for 7 weeks. He said, I didn't lie. I actually repeated that because I thought maybe I'd had a stroke. You didn't lie. He said, I just didn't tell you yet because every time I bring up doing something different, you panic and make me feel small. I said, different? You mean secretly unemployed. He snapped then, I'm trying to build something. God, This is exactly why I didn't want to tell you. You don't support anything unless it's your idea and your spreadsheet and your approved timeline. I don't know why that sentence broke me more than the money stuff did. Maybe because it was such a clean rewrite of reality. Me, the person paying bills, covering gaps, asking basic questions, cast as the controlling obstacle to his secret life. I asked if his mother knew he hadn't told me. He didn't answer fast enough. That was my answer. I said, "So you two have been planning this together while I'm over here thinking we're saving for rent." He said, "You always make everything uglier than it is." And then, because apparently the universe wasn't done humiliating me, his phone buzzed on the table. A text from his mom popped up on the screen. Did she calm down, or is she still making this about herself? He grabbed the phone too late. I had already seen it. I wish I could say I stayed composed. I didn't. I said something like, "Get out of my face before I become somebody I don't recognize," which sounds dramatic, sure, but I had just realized I was the only person in my marriage who didn't know what was happening in it. He left. Not for long, just long enough to make a point. He came back an hour later and slept on the couch like he was the victim of my instability. This morning his sister called me. We are not especially close, but she sounded weird and asked if I was alone. Then she said, "I think you need to know he showed your note to Mom." I thought she meant he mentioned it. No. He took a picture of the note I wrote, the 2 pages where I basically bled out all my grief, and sent it to their family group chat. According to his sister, his mom replied, "She always needs an audience." His older brother sent a laughing emoji. Someone else said, "Hide the knives." I made her repeat that because I couldn't believe it. She started crying before I did. She said she was sorry and that it felt disgusting, and she only found out because she muted the chat and checked it this morning. I feel hollow, actually hollow, not just because of the money or the lies, because I handed the most honest thing I've ever written to the person who's supposed to protect me, and he turned it into content for the family circus. I've been asking myself whether this marriage is over. Now, I think the question is whether it was ever the marriage I thought I was in. I took the afternoon off work. I'm at my friend Noor's apartment now. I brought one overnight bag, my laptop, and the folder of financial stuff. I haven't told my mother because she'll get on a plane and make everything worse. I also haven't told him yet that I know about the group chat. But there's one more thing. While printing the bank statements at Noor's place, I noticed a charge I didn't recognize from a legal document service. I clicked into the attached receipt. It had my name on it. Not as customer. As guarantor, I haven't signed anything. I know I haven't. So if my stomach is right about what I'm looking at, this is about to get so much worse. Update 2. It got worse. A lot worse. First, thank you to the people who told me to stop confronting him alone and to talk to an actual lawyer before I said another word. Noor's cousin is a paralegal, and through her I got a consultation with an attorney yesterday morning. I walked in feeling ridiculous, like maybe I was wasting everyone's time over marital problems. I walked out with a legal pad full of instructions and the terrifying realization that I have been underreacting for years. The document service charge was exactly what I feared. My husband used my information on paperwork connected to the food truck business plan, not just my name typed as some casual reference. My full legal name, old address history, and income information were attached to a personal guarantee packet for a small business equipment lease. The attorney said whether it counts as outright forgery depends on what exactly was submitted and how, but in plain English, he tried to strap me to a secret debt without telling me. I think a part of me still expected there to be some explanation that was bad but not evil, some version where he was stupid, not calculating. But once the attorney started going through the dates, it became impossible to keep lying to myself. He didn't go silent because my note hurt him. He went silent because he needed time. Time to see what I knew. Time to keep me emotionally off balance. Time to finish paperwork. Time to keep the lies standing long enough to get what he wanted. That realization cracked something open in me. I went back to the apartment with Noor and her brother because my lawyer told me not to go alone. I wanted my passport, my birth certificate, my late dad's ring, and the lockbox where I keep the last of the money I inherited when my dad died. The ring was there. The lockbox was not. For one full second, I thought I was going to pass out. I had to sit on the floor because my hearing went weird and far away. There wasn't a ton of money in it, but it was mine. Separate. Untouched for years. I kept it because it was the only money in my life that didn't have stress attached to it. My dad worked himself sick, and when he died, everything was chaos and paperwork and casseroles from people who barely knew us. That money was small, but it felt sacred. I asked my husband where the lockbox was. He was standing in the kitchen, suddenly very interested in acting calm because other people were there. He said, I moved some things around. I honestly almost laughed because that was the same phrase he used about the savings, like theft becomes neutral if you phrase it like furniture. I said, where is it? He said, can we not do this in front of people? Noor's brother, who is built like a refrigerator and had been completely silent until then, said, you're lucky it's in front of people. My husband glared at him, then looked at me and did this thing I know so well, softened his face, lowered his voice, switched into private, intimate mode like we were just two hurt people having a misunderstanding. He said, babe, I was going to tell you everything. I just needed you to not freak out. I stared at him and realized I hated that word now. Babe. He uses it most when he needs me pliable. I said, did you take my lockbox? He said, I borrowed from it. Borrowed? Again with the words. I asked how much. He said, not much. Noor said, that's not a number. Then he got mad. Really mad. The mask slipped all at once. He started pacing and saying I was humiliating him, that I was making him look like some criminal over temporary money movement, that husbands and wives don't act like this, that I'm cold and punitive and impossible to build a future with because I need every decision to come with a committee hearing. And then he said the sentence that finished whatever love I had left. If you had just believed in me for once, none of this would have happened. Not I'm sorry I lied. Not I'm sorry I used your money. Not I'm sorry I sent your note to my family. Just if I had believed harder, he wouldn't have needed to betray me. I asked him how much was missing from the lockbox. He looked at the floor and said 8. I said, 800. He said nothing. It was $8,000. I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe right. Not loud crying. The ugly, silent kind that feels like your ribs are caving in. Noor wrapped her arms around me and I remember feeling embarrassed, which tells you everything about how trained I've become to manage other people while I'm the one being wrecked. Then, because apparently cruelty runs on blood in that family, his mother walked in. Yes, walked in. With her own key. I did not know she still had one. She took one look at the scene and said, I knew she'd turn this into a spectacle. I have replayed the next 5 minutes in my head 100 times because it was the first time in years I didn't fold. I stood up. My face was hot, my hands were shaking, and I said very clearly, get out. She laughed. Actually laughed. This is my son's home too. And I said, not for much longer. You should have seen my husband's face when he realized I meant it. One thing I forgot to mention, the apartment lease is in my name because I got it through an employee housing program linked to my clinic. He lives here as an approved occupant, but the lease exists because of me. That little fact never mattered to him before because he never thought I'd stop trying to save him. My lawyer had already told me what steps to take. I had already sent the management office the documentation. I had already frozen the joint savings account and flagged the suspicious business paperwork. I had already changed my direct deposit and put fraud alerts on my credit. For the first time in our entire relationship, I was moving faster than he was. His mother kept talking. Something about loyalty and how men need room to build and how I was sabotaging my own marriage over temporary hardship. Then she made the mistake of saying, you always were too emotional to be a real partner, and something in me just went still. I said, you raised a man who thinks lying, stealing, and mocking his wife is leadership. You don't get to define partnership for me. Dead silence, not movie silence, real silence. The kind where people stop moving. Even my husband looked stunned, like he had genuinely forgotten I could speak without asking permission first. He tried a different tactic after that. Crying. I'm not exaggerating. As soon as his mother realized we weren't backing down and left in a fury, he sat on the couch and started crying into his hands. Said he was scared. Said he felt like a failure after losing his job. Said he knew I'd leave if I found out, and he panicked. Said his mom got in his head about opportunities and believing in family. Said the group chat was a joke, and he didn't think it would hurt me that much. That part almost made Noor throw something. I asked one question, when were you planning to tell me about using my inheritance? He said, when the truck started making money, I was going to put it all back. That was his grand defense. Future success as retroactive consent. I took my documents, clothes, and the dog. I left. And then last night, his sister sent me screenshots of the family group chat. I was right not to tell him I knew. It was worse than she first said. He didn't just post my note. He captioned it, Monday mood board from the world's most impossible wife. His mother replied she'd be miserable on a yacht. His brother said, bro, just tell her yes, babe, and wait till she gets tired. And my husband answered, that's the plan. That's the plan. Wait till she gets tired. 8 years of my life, summarized in one sentence. I thought I had reached the bottom already, but apparently there was a basement. My lawyer is helping me sort the rest. My husband has been blowing up my phone today with long, emotional messages alternating between apology, blame, nostalgia, and panic. He says I'm ruining both our futures by involving lawyers. He says I know he's not a bad person. He says his mother poisoned everything. He says he loves me. He says he'll cut them all off. He says he'll sell the truck. He says he'll do therapy. He says he was drowning. And maybe he was. But he tried to use my body as a life raft without asking if I wanted to drown with him. There's one final thing I haven't done yet. I haven't filed the police report over the forged documents. I was hesitating because once I do that, there's no pretending this is just a marriage in trouble. It becomes exactly what it is. Final update. I filed the report. I sat in my car outside the station for 20 minutes first, crying with both hands on the steering wheel because some old version of me still believed protecting him was the same thing as being loving. That version of me kept whispering that making it official was cruel, that maybe this was too far, that maybe if I just walked away quietly I could still be the bigger person. But I'm done with the version of being a good woman that requires me to be a smaller human. So I went inside. I brought copies of the business paperwork, the statements, the screenshots, the timeline my lawyer helped me make, and the messages where he effectively admitted he used my inheritance and planned to put it back. The officer I spoke with was calmer than I expected, which somehow made the whole thing more real. No dramatic music. No moral speech. Just forms and facts and dates and signatures. And once I did it, I felt something I was not expecting. Relief. Not happiness. Not triumph. Relief. Like my nervous system had been waiting for me to stop negotiating with reality. Everything moved quickly after that. The equipment leasing company contacted my attorney and confirmed the application had been flagged because the income documentation looked inconsistent. They had already frozen processing. So that debt did not go through my name, thank God. The apartment management approved removing him from occupancy. He had 3 days to collect his remaining things with a scheduled escort. Suddenly, the man who spent years acting like I was overreacting was texting me things like, please don't do this coldly, and can we at least talk like adults? That phrase almost made me laugh. Like adults. From the man who sent my pain to the family group chat for entertainment. His mother called me from 3 different numbers after I blocked the first 2. On the third voicemail, she switched tactics from righteous to sugary and said, whatever misunderstanding happened, there's no need to destroy a young man's future over family stress. I saved the voicemail and sent it to my lawyer. Then something happened that I genuinely did not predict. His sister moved out of their mother's house. Apparently the group chat screenshots weren't the only thing that had been eating at her. She called me 2 nights ago and said watching all of this made her realize the family has been built around one rule: protect the sons, train the women to absorb impact. She told me I was the first person she'd ever seen say no out loud and mean it. That sentence has been haunting me in a good way, because I keep thinking about how many years I confused endurance with love, how many times I called myself patient when I was really just afraid, how often I thought if I explained my pain the right way, in the right tone, at the right moment, to the right version of him, he would finally care. But the truth is uglier and simpler. He understood. He just didn't mind. That has been the hardest thing to accept, and also the most freeing. As for him, the truck is gone. He sold it fast because he needed money and because, according to one spectacularly bitter text, you've made everything impossible. His mother is now claiming the food truck was mostly her idea and she never reviewed any documents. He is suddenly discovering what it feels like when the person you trusted most rewrites history to save themselves. I would feel sorrier for him if I hadn't lived inside that feeling for nearly a decade. A few people asked whether I ever got the full inheritance money back. Not all of it. Probably not for a while. But enough is being documented that I have a real shot at recovering a portion through the legal process, and more importantly, I'm no longer letting him tell the story of what happened. The facts are the facts now. They exist outside his mood. I moved into a smaller apartment across town last weekend. It's quiet, weirdly quiet. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m. in a panic because I thought I heard him come through the door. Then I remembered I was alone, and instead of feeling empty, I felt safe. The dog settled faster than I did. She claimed the corner by the window on day one and acts like we've always lived here. I bought a cheap secondhand table and ate takeout on the floor and cried because nobody was rolling their eyes at me for crying. Nobody was asking why I was making a moment out of things. Nobody was teaching me to doubt my own pulse. Yesterday, I found the note. Not the original one, that's gone, but a photo I took right after I wrote it because some part of me wanted proof that I had finally said everything clearly. I reread it expecting to feel embarrassed. Instead, I felt proud of her. She was already leaving even before her body caught up. The last message I sent my husband was 3 sentences. You were right about one thing. I was never happy. I was surviving. Those are not the same thing. He replied almost instantly, I hope this was worth it. And for the first time in 8 years, I didn't sit there trying to find the perfect response that would make him understand me. I just blocked him. Story 3. My employee wants my bakery closed for her wedding, and I'm apparently the villain for saying no. She didn't ask for a cake discount or a day off. She wanted my entire business on our busiest weekend, as if payroll, rent, suppliers, and reality were all just rude little details standing in the way of her perfect photos. I'm writing this because I genuinely don't know whether I'm losing my mind or just discovering very late in life that if you own a small business long enough, people stop seeing it as your livelihood and start seeing it as a pretty backdrop they're entitled to borrow. I'm Emil. I'm 38 and I own a bakery and cafe in Bruges called De Kornbrug. It's a narrow old place near one of the canals with cream-colored walls, green shutters, a tiny upstairs office, and a cobbled courtyard behind it that people photograph constantly whether they buy anything or not. It used to belong to my father, then to me after he died, and for the last 8 years I have spent more time there than I have spent anywhere else in my life. I met my wife Margaret while I was doing a renovation on the back room. I missed my cousin's engagement party because a freezer broke. I took supplier calls on the morning of my father's funeral because the Easter orders had already been paid for, and I couldn't afford to lose the week. That's the kind of business this is. It's lovely to outsiders. To me, it's also invoices sleepless nights, late tax filings, burned hands, and a monthly calculation of whether I can keep everyone on without cutting my own pay again. Clara has worked for me for a little over 4 years. She's 27, sharp, charming, one of those people who can remember what kind of tea a tourist from Hamburg ordered 2 days ago and somehow make them feel like they've come home. When she started, she was gold. She was reliable, funny, warm with customers, good with the till, patient with older visitors who wanted to practice their French or Dutch or English all at once. During the winter slow months, when half the city goes gray and sleepy, she was the one keeping the front of house alive. I trusted her. I'm not saying we were family, because I hate when employers say that, but she was important. She mattered to the place. Our manager, Peter, handles most of the rota and front of house issues now, mostly because if I try to do every single thing myself, I turn into the kind of man who starts arguments with refrigerator doors. Soren is my head baker. Luca does washing up and prep 3 days a week while finishing school. Matteo supplies some of our specialty coffee and imported flour. So when I say a small business, I mean genuinely small. If one person sneezes, the rest of us feel it in the schedule. Last autumn, Clara got engaged to her boyfriend, Niels. Nice enough man. I'd met him twice, maybe 3 times. Tall, quiet, works in event lighting in Ghent. She came in one morning with a ring and cried in the stockroom while hugging everybody, and I was happy for her. Truly, I gave her the day off. Margaret sent over a bottle of cremant that night, and when Clara came back the next week, I told her that if she wanted us to do a cake or pastries for the wedding, I'd make sure we looked after her. That was it. That was the extent of what I believed I was offering. A kindness, a gesture, a normal employer saying, "Congratulations, we'll help where we can." If I had known that in Clara's mind, "we'll help where we can" meant you will eventually hand over the whole bakery like a municipal heritage site available for private booking, I would have been more specific. The first odd moment happened in January. We had just finished the morning rush, and Clara was wiping down the front display while talking to Sophie, one of our weekend servers. I was boxing up an order near enough to hear, but not close enough to be part of the conversation. Clara was talking about possible wedding dates and casually said, "Well, obviously it has to be when the courtyard is green again, so late May or June makes sense, and I'll need Emil to block the weekend." That made me look up. Not because employees can't have wedding conversations at work. I'm not a monster. But because of the wording, "need Emil to block the weekend," sounded less like hope and more like logistics. I said, lightly, "Block what weekend?" She smiled as if I were being slow. "For the wedding." I thought maybe she meant leave your holiday days? "No, the bakery," she said, still smiling. "For the venue." I actually laughed at first, not in a cruel way, more in a reflexive way, because I assumed she was joking. Die Korenbrug is beautiful in the right light, yes, but it is not a wedding venue. It's a working bakery with flour in the air, refrigerators humming, delivery crates stacked by the back wall, and a courtyard we use for overflow seating and suppliers cutting through when the alley is blocked. It looks romantic in pictures because pictures do not include the bins. So I said, "I know we can't close on a summer weekend, but we can absolutely talk cake." She looked confused, then embarrassed, then strangely blank. "I thought since you said you'd help." "I meant cake, pastries, maybe a discount," I said. "Not closing the shop," she said. "Right." In that careful tone people use when they are too annoyed to trust themselves. I assumed it was just a misunderstanding. That was my first mistake. A week later, she came to the office upstairs with her laptop and a notebook, not asking if she could sit, not asking if I had time. She came in with the energy of someone arriving for a meeting that had already been agreed. She spread out printed photographs of the courtyard, screenshots from Pinterest, a rough guest plan, and a type sheet titled June Wedding Flow. I remember staring at that title because there's something deeply unnerving about seeing your own workplace converted into a fantasy plan without your consent. It's like walking into your living room and finding someone has already chosen where your furniture will go for their party. Clara began talking quickly. Ceremony in the courtyard at 2. Guests arrived through the side gate. Welcome drinks against the back wall. We could move the terrace tables into storage Friday night. She would keep the color palette muted so it wouldn't fight with the bakery signage. Niels's friend could drape fabric over the espresso machine area if we wanted indoor photos. The cake display would be actually incredible in pictures if we removed branded price cards. She even had ideas for my staff uniforms so they'd blend aesthetically if anyone accidentally appeared in the background before closure. I let her talk for a minute or two because I honestly needed to hear enough to understand whether this was ambition, delusion, or some kind of stress response. Then I stopped her. I said, "Clara, I need to be very clear. This is not happening." She looked at me as if I'd interrupted her in the middle of something universally understood. "What do you mean?" "I mean you cannot have your wedding here in a way that closes my business." Her whole face changed. "Not even for one day?" "It wouldn't be one day," I said. "You're talking about Friday evening setup, Saturday closure, Sunday cleanup. And June Saturdays are some of our biggest days of the year." She leaned back and folded her arms. "I work here?" "Yes," I said, because I didn't know what else she thought that proved. "I've given 4 years to this place, and I appreciate that," I said. "That still doesn't mean I shut down operations for a private wedding." Then came the first sentence that made me realize this was going to be uglier than I expected. She said, "You wouldn't be shutting down for a private wedding. You'd be supporting one of your own." That phrase, "one of your own." It sounds warm until it's used as leverage. I told her calmly that I was not refusing to support her. I was refusing a request that would cost me thousands of euros in lost trade, staff complications, supplier disruptions, and probably some insurance nightmare I hadn't even begun to identify. She said I was exaggerating. I said I was not. She said the bakery had emotional meaning because she had met Niels there when he used to come in before work. That was true. He had. He used to order black coffee and a pain au chocolate every Thursday. Apparently, in her mind, that had transformed the place from my business into part of her love story. I offered alternatives. I said we could make the cake at cost. I said we could open the courtyard for a small photo session before opening one weekday if it didn't disrupt service. I said if she wanted a rehearsal brunch on a Monday when we're closed, Maybe we could discuss that separately. She didn't want alternatives. She wanted what she had already imagined. She gathered her papers very slowly. Then she said, I already told my mother it was basically sorted. That was the moment I understood the real problem. She hadn't been asking. She had been pre-announcing. After that conversation, things went quiet for maybe 10 days, but not in a good way, in a pressure cooker way. Clara was polite to me in front of customers and frosted over the second they left. Peter told me she had started asking about which staff members might be willing to help out. The wedding, if she could convince Emil not to be difficult. Sophie asked if the bakery would get extra publicity from hosting an event because Clara had apparently mentioned local wedding blogs. Luca, who is sweet but 18 and easily impressed by anything involving fairy lights, asked whether he'd have to wear a waistcoat. I called Peter into the office and asked exactly what had been said. He rubbed his face and told me Clara had been speaking as if the whole thing was still under discussion, but only because I was being emotional about money. He actually used that phrase, emotional about money, as if wanting the business that pays everyone's wages to remain open is some kind of melodramatic quirk. Peter knows me well enough to know when I'm angry and when I'm trying very hard not to become angry. He said, Do you want me to shut this down with staff? I said no, because I still thought I could handle it directly without humiliating her. Second mistake. A few days later, Niels came in just after lunch, when the cafe was half full, and asked if we could talk. I took him to the back because I don't enjoy public scenes. He had his phone out with some floor plan app open and immediately started discussing where a rental arch could stand without blocking sight lines. Not asking if it could stand there. Discussing where, I stopped him and said, I think Clara has misunderstood me. I already told her the business will not be closing for your wedding. He blinked. She said you were hesitant about the exact hours. No, I said. I said no. He was quiet for a second, then gave me the kind of smile people use when they are about to frame selfishness as practicality. Look, I know it's not ideal timing, but this place means a lot to her. And if it's just a question of lost revenue, we could maybe work something out. That irritated me more than I expected. Not because money was mentioned, but because of how casually. As if the problem was one line in a spreadsheet instead of a chain reaction through payroll, contracts, customer trust, and the fact that I am not a municipal square available for hire. I asked him what work something out meant. He said they couldn't pay commercial venue rates because wedding costs were already high, but maybe some reduced amount, and she assumed staff rates on the catering. I nearly laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. I said, You want me to close my bakery on a June Saturday, lose the day's income, lose the goodwill of regulars and tourists, risk issues with staff scheduling and suppliers, provide catering at discount, and possibly pretend this is some sentimental gesture because your fiancé works here? He said, When you say it like that, it sounds bad. I said, It is bad. He didn't get angry. He got wounded, which was somehow more infuriating. He said Clara had spent months building this picture in her head, and I should have shut it down earlier if it wasn't possible. I told him I had shut it down the first time it was presented as an actual idea. He said she took my original offer to help as encouragement. I said then she took it wrongly. He left stiffly polite, and 10 minutes later I got a message from Clara asking why I had ambushed Niels. That word ambush, after her fiancé showed up at my workplace to negotiate access to property I had already denied him, was enough to make me put my phone down and go stand in the walk-in fridge for 2 minutes before I answered. I told her he had approached me, not the other way around, and that nothing had changed, no closure, no private use of the bakery, no assumption of access. I also told her we needed to keep wedding planning out of staff discussions because it was starting to affect work. She replied, I didn't realize setting boundaries only works one way. There is a type of person who learns therapy language just enough to weaponize it against whoever tells them no. Clara had apparently become that person. Margot told me to put everything in writing. Margot is almost always right, which is annoying when you want your wife to be soothing instead of correct. She said, You're still acting like this is a misunderstanding. It stopped being a misunderstanding when other people started contacting you. So I drafted a clean, polite email. I said I was confirming that De Kornbrugge would remain open as normal on all scheduled operating days and could not be used as a private wedding venue. I repeated the alternatives I had offered: discounted cake, pastries, and possibly a brief weekday photo session in the courtyard outside customer hours if arranged in advance. I sent it to Clara and copied Peter because I wanted a witness, not because I wanted to embarrass her. If the story had ended there, I would not be writing this. Instead, a week later, our landlord, Celine, called me. She owns the building and the 2 adjacent units, and while I lease the bakery space, the rear access gate and part of the courtyard arrangement involve shared building permissions. Celine is one of those impossibly elegant women from Brussels who sounds like she's gently judging everyone even when she's ordering soup. She asked, very calmly, whether I was hosting a private wedding event in June and whether additional insurance certificates had been filed. I remember gripping the phone harder and saying, "What wedding event?" She said someone named Renate had called asking about noise allowances, use of the shared passage, and whether confetti was prohibited on the stones because my daughter is being married at Emil's bakery. Renate, of course, was Clara's mother. That was the first moment I felt something colder than annoyance, because now we were outside the realm of entitled fantasy and well into the realm of real administrative consequences caused by somebody else's assumptions. If Celine had taken that call differently, she could have believed I was concealing an event. If there had been complaints later, it could have landed on me. If anything had been signed or informally promised, I would have been cleaning it up. I told Celine absolutely not. There was no approved event, and I was sorry she had been dragged into a private matter. She said good, because I found it unusually presumptuous. Then she hung up, which in Celine language is essentially a full-throated condemnation. I asked Clara to come in early the next morning before opening. She arrived with puffy eyes and that brittle expression people wear when they've already decided they are the victim of whatever conversation is coming. I said, "Did your mother contact my landlord about a wedding you do not have permission to hold here?" Instead of answering directly, she said she was trying to understand logistics because nobody is communicating clearly. I stared at her. I communicated clearly in person by message and by email. She started crying then, sudden and theatrical, though maybe genuinely upset, I don't know. She said I didn't understand how much pressure she was under, that venues in Bruges were expensive, that this bakery was important to her history with Niels, that her mother had already told relatives in Antwerp and Lille about the setting, that her sister Freja had designed invitations around the courtyard, that changing everything would be humiliating, that she had given this place years of her life and thought I cared more about community. Then this. There's a very unpleasant thing that happens when someone piles emotional language on top of a practical violation. For a split second, you start defending yourself against the feelings instead of the facts. I caught myself doing it. I nearly said, "Of course I care," which would have shifted us immediately onto her ground, where the issue becomes whether I'm kind enough, loyal enough, sentimental enough. So I pulled it back. I said, "Clara, none of this gives you the right to volunteer my business for your wedding." She wiped her face and said, "I didn't volunteer it. I believed you would come around once you saw what it meant." That sentence stayed with me because it explained everything. She genuinely believed that persistence was not pressure, that if she loved the idea enough, reality would eventually become rude for resisting her. I told her that from this point forward, she was not to discuss the bakery as her venue with staff, family, suppliers, or guests. I told her nobody was to contact Celine again. I told her if there was any printed material or invitation naming De Korenbrug as a wedding location, it needed to be corrected immediately because it had never been authorized. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't shouting. But I was firm in a way I think she had not expected from me because up to that point I had still been trying to keep everything soft around the edges. She looked at me with a kind of shock, then said, "So that's it? After everything I've done here?" I said, "This is not a reward you earn." That should have ended it. Instead, 3 days later Matteo arrived with samples I had not ordered. Tall glass bottles for elderflower syrup, specialty chocolates, decorative sugar petals, and some ridiculous imported sugared violets that cost more than decent wine. He said Clara had told him we were considering an upscale wedding package and asked whether we might get trade pricing if we featured his coffee at the reception. I cannot properly describe the exhaustion of discovering that someone is turning your repeated refusal into a kind of pre-launch rumor campaign. At that point, even Pieter, who hates conflict with the passion of a saintly schoolteacher, said, "She cannot stay on shift if she's doing this." I didn't want to fire her. I still didn't. Not just because it's drastic, but because she really had been good for years, and because once you own a small business, you understand that ending someone's job is not a clean, dramatic flourish. It's rent, groceries, references, shockwaves. But I was also reaching the point where every interaction with her felt like a liability. Then came the invitations. Not a copy. An actual printed invitation, cream card with dark green lettering, hand delivered by Freja, the sister, who came in smiling and said Clara wanted my opinion on whether the script was readable for older guests. I looked at it and saw in beautiful formal type that the wedding ceremony of Clara and Niels would be held in the historic courtyard of de Corimbrug, Bruges, followed by her exclusive private reception. For a second, I actually could not speak. I could hear the espresso grinder running, cups clinking, tourists laughing near the front, and all of it sounded very far away. Freja, to her credit, immediately realized something was wrong. She said, "Wait, has she not told you?" I asked very carefully, "Told me what?" "That the invitations already went to print," she said. I asked if they had been sent. She hesitated. "Most of them?" There are moments when anger feels hot, and there are moments when it becomes almost icy because your brain gets very simple. My brain got simple. I went to the office, called Clara, and asked her to come upstairs immediately. She came up, took one look at the invitation on the desk, and started crying before I even spoke, which told me she knew exactly how indefensible it was. I asked her one question: "Why would you print and circulate invitations naming my bakery as your venue after I said no?" She said, "Because I didn't know how to tell people it might change." I said, "Then you tell them it might change. You do not lie." She said she thought if things were far enough along, I might choose compassion over stubbornness. Compassion over stubbornness. I remember laughing then, but it was an ugly laugh. I said, "You mean if you created enough social pressure, I would have no choice?" She said I always had a choice, which is the kind of technical truth manipulative people love. Yes, technically I always had a choice. One choice was to absorb financial damage and let her family parade through my business. The other was to become the villain in the story she had already been telling everybody. I asked whether she understood how serious this was. She said yes. I asked whether she had told guests the venue was confirmed. She said yes. I asked whether she had arranged vendors around my bakery. She said some of them, yes. I asked whether any money had changed hands based on that claim. She started talking about deposits, and I had to stop her because at that point I genuinely thought my blood pressure might knock me over. I told her she had until the end of the day to send me written confirmation that every vendor and every relevant guest had been informed the bakery was not her venue. I told her if anyone else contacted me, Celine, or my suppliers, I would have no choice but to begin formal disciplinary action up to and including dismissal. I told her she was leaving shift immediately. That afternoon, Renate called me. If Clara was emotional blackmail in modern language, Renate was old school guilt wielded like a carving knife. She said I was humiliating her daughter over a misunderstanding. She said in her day employers took pride in helping staff begin their lives. She said my father would have been ashamed. That part nearly made me see red, because she had never met my father, and because people love borrowing the dead when the living are inconvenient. I told her very quietly never to invoke my father again. She huffed and said, "So you'd really rather keep selling tarts to tourists than let a young woman have her day?" And that, finally, was the sentence that snapped whatever remained of my patience. Because yes, I would rather keep selling tarts to tourists. Because those tarts pay Luca, they pay Soren, they pay electricity, they pay the insurance, they pay the tax bill, they pay the loan I took when the oven died. They pay for the fact that when Clara got the flu last winter, I covered shifts rather than cutting her hours. They pay for every generous impulse people seem to think small business owners can run on indefinitely like battery power. So I said, with respect, Madame, I would rather keep my business functioning than shut it down because your daughter decided my refusal was negotiable. She started crying too then, which in that family seems to be both emotion and strategy, and said I had no heart. Maybe I didn't in that moment. The next week was horrible. Clara was off shift pending a meeting, and the atmosphere in the bakery felt like the day after someone drops a plate in a restaurant, and everyone keeps working while pretending they didn't jump. Sophie thought I was being too hard because wedding stress makes people irrational. Peter thought I had already been too soft. Soren asked one question only. Are we baking that weekend or not? Which was honestly refreshing in its purity. Margaret, who had now heard every detail whether she wanted to or not, said something that cut through all the noise. She said, "You are still worried about sounding cruel to a person who has repeatedly treated your no as a draft." That is exactly what it felt like. Like every refusal was just version 1 of an answer she planned to revise. I met with Clara and Peter 2 days later. I gave her the chance to explain. She apologized, but in that careful half-shaped way that never lands because it is built around your reaction instead of their action. She said she was sorry things had gotten out of hand. Sorry I felt undermined. Sorry people had contacted me. Sorry pressure had built up. Not sorry she made the decision she made. Not really. The center of the apology was still her panic, her embarrassment, her ruined plans. I asked her why she thought any of this was acceptable. She said, after a long silence, "Because you're not usually this hard." That sentence almost impressed me with its honesty. Not because I'm weak, not because I have no boundaries, but because I had spent years trying to be fair, human, flexible, understanding. I had swapped shifts, advanced wages once for a family emergency, let people take home leftovers, covered absences myself, kept staff during bad months when it hurt, and somewhere in that Clara had decided fairness meant eventual surrender. I gave her a formal warning rather than dismissing her outright. Peter thought I was mad. Maybe I was. But I did it because I could see she was spiraling, because I didn't want to blow up her livelihood over one escalating boundary violation even though it had become several, and because part of me still believed she might come back to Earth once the fantasy collapsed. She accepted the warning, cried again, and asked if I at least still intended to do the wedding cake. I just looked at her. Not dramatically. Not even angrily. I just looked at her until she realized what she had asked. She left without another word. Since then, the practical situation has been this. The bakery remains open. Obviously, the wedding is apparently now happening at a hotel outside Ostend because a cousin managed a connection. Clara is still employed for the moment, though everything between us is formal and cold. She does her job. I do mine. The old ease is gone. Niels no longer comes in. Renate never has, thank God. Freja actually came by alone last week to apologize for the invitation situation and said she had told Clara months ago not to assume anything. That was almost comforting in a bleak way because it confirmed I wasn't the only person watching this train roll downhill. But the reason I'm still upset and the reason I'm writing this instead of just moving on is because I still haven't said the thing that is sitting right on my tongue. Because there is a part of me that wants, the next time Clara or anyone implies I was heartless, to say exactly this. Your wedding is not more important than my business. Your dream is not a lion on my livelihood. Working somewhere does not make you entitled to convert it into your private stage set. And if the only way your plan ever worked was by ignoring my answer until social pressure forced my hand, then it was never a plan. It was coercion in a pretty dress. I haven't said it, not in those words. Maybe because once you say something that's true, there's no going back to polite fiction. Maybe because I know how it will sound repeated by someone else after it passes through 3 family members and a bridesmaid group chat. Maybe because part of adulthood, especially in business, is learning that you can be completely right and still decide the cleanest version of right is the one you can live with professionally. But I am tired. I am tired of the expectation that small business owners are community props until the bill arrives. I am tired of people confusing sentiment with access. I am tired of being told I should feel honored that someone wants to use the thing I nearly broke myself building. I do feel proud of it, but pride is not permission. And maybe the ugliest part is this: if Clara had come to me in the beginning and said, "I know this is a huge ask and probably impossible, but this place matters to me and I had to ask," I would have felt sympathy. I would have tried harder to give her something meaningful. Maybe I would have opened on a Monday for a private breakfast. Maybe I would have arranged a proper photo hour with pastries and flowers. Maybe I would have done a better cake than she could have afforded elsewhere and made it gorgeous. I am not ungenerous by nature, but entitlement poisons generosity. Once someone decides your kindness is the down payment on their demands, every favor starts to feel like extortion. So that's where I am, owning the same bakery, waking before dawn, arguing with butter prices, smiling at customers, saying good morning, pretending I don't sometimes look at the courtyard and imagine rows of chairs I never agreed to. while wondering how close I came to becoming the bad man in someone else's wedding story simply because I understood that romance does not pay commercial rent. Story 4. My sister didn't steal my job, my flat, or a man. She stole something worse. She became the version of me my family was always willing to love. I feel like my sister stole my life. I'm posting this here because I don't know how to explain it to people in real life without sounding melodramatic, bitter, or mentally unwell. And maybe I am bitter. Maybe I've earned it. But I need to say this somewhere plain. I feel like my sister stole my life, and the worst part is that everyone around me thinks I should be grateful to her for it. My name is Clara. I'm 34. I live in Vienna now, and I haven't spoken properly to my younger sister in 8 months. Her name is Sophie. She's 32. If you met us both separately, you would probably like her more. That is not self-pity. That is just data. Sophie has always had that soft, open, bright kind of face that makes strangers tell her their problems in grocery queues. She has the kind of laugh that makes people turn and smile before they even know what the joke was. She remembers birthdays, she buys the exact right gift, she cries at weddings, and she has an unnerving talent for telling a story in a way that makes even the ugly parts sound charming. I am the older sister, which in my family meant being born as unpaid infrastructure. We grew up in Graz. Our father, Thomas, worked in rail maintenance and believed that affection was best expressed through provision, not conversation. Our mother, Helena, worked part-time in a pharmacy until her back got bad and then mostly ran the house as if it were an institution permanently on the edge of collapse. We were not poor in the dramatic Dickensian sense. We always had food, heat, school supplies, coats, and one holiday most summers if the car survived the year without a major repair. But everything in our home was built around fragility. Money was fragile. Tempers were fragile. Health was fragile. Reputation was fragile. Peace, above all, was fragile. So from very early on, I became useful. Useful children are often described as mature. What they usually are is frightened and observant. I learned quickly that if I packed my own lunch, checked Sophie's homework, cleared plates without being asked, and never needed anyone to chase me, the house ran more smoothly. If I sensed our father's silence turning dangerous, I would lower the radio, get Sophie out of the room, and find some practical task to absorb the tension. If our mother got one of her headaches and had to lie in the dark, I would make pasta and pretend it was fun. Sophie was not useless. I need to be fair about that. She was younger, more openly emotional, more prone to forgetting things, more likely to cry if shouted at, and more likely to receive comfort afterward. That combination changed everything. I learned to anticipate. She learned that if she collapsed visibly enough, adults rushed toward her. Neither of us chose that dynamic in any conscious way. But children become what gets rewarded. When I was 10 and she was 8, I broke a mug while washing dishes, and our mother snapped, "Clara, honestly, can I not trust you with one simple thing?" I remember staring at the broken handle in the sink and thinking absurdly clearly that if Sophie had broken it, the conversation would have been about whether the mug had been too slippery for small hands. That sounds petty written down now, but I think that was the first moment I understood that responsibility is a trap if other people start treating it as your natural state. Once you're the competent one, your mistakes become betrayals. At school, I was the serious girl, the one teachers liked because I did the reading and lined the margins properly and never made them repeat instructions. Sophie, 2 years behind me, was spirited. If I came home with a 92, our father would nod and say, "A's expected." If she came home with an 81 after scraping by on charisma and a tearful promise to focus harder next term, our mother would say, "That's brilliant, darling. See what you can do when you apply yourself." This is not a story about grades, but small patterns matter because they teach you what your role is supposed to be. Mine was to do well quietly. Hers was to be celebrated for trying. It became sharper in secondary school. I loved literature and history. I wanted structured books, maybe university somewhere far enough away that I could build a self not tied to who had remembered to defrost chicken. Sophie loved people, or maybe people loved her, and she learned to move through that warmth as naturally as fish move through water. She joined clubs without staying in them long, made friends in every year group, dated boys too early, cried too hard when they disappointed her, and somehow remained everyone's darling. When I was 17, I got accepted into a summer academic program in Salzburg. It sounds small now, but at the time it felt like a door opening in a wall I had assumed was load-bearing. 3 weeks away seminars, university lectures, a chance to imagine becoming someone whose life did not revolve around whether the washing machine was making that sound again. I was ecstatic. 2 weeks before it began, Sophie fell off a horse during a riding lesson and fractured her wrist. Not a devastating injury. Painful, yes. Inconvenient, yes. But not catastrophic. Still, the household instantly reorganized itself around her. Our mother had to accompany her to appointments. Our father was working overtime. Sophie needed help showering, dressing, tying her hair, carrying school things, and because I was there, and because I was so capable, the unspoken expectation arrived like whether I would stay. I still remember the conversation in the kitchen. I said, "The program starts next Monday." My mother didn't even turn fully toward me. She was cutting vegetables one-handed because the other was holding the phone between shoulder and ear. "I know, Schatz. So am I still going?" There was a pause. That awful pause where you realize everyone assumed you would answer your own question correctly. My father from the table said, "This is not the moment to be selfish, for wanting the thing I had earned before anyone broke any bones." Sophie started crying immediately. Not because I had said anything cruel, just because crying was how she metabolized tension. Then I became the villain by standing in the room while she cried. I didn't go to Salzburg. Everyone thanked me later as though I had volunteered nobly rather than been cornered. My mother said, "We couldn't have managed without you." My father said, "Sometimes family comes first." Sophie hugged me with her good arm and whispered, "I'm sorry." And I said, "It's fine," because what else was I supposed to say? "No, actually, I resent your radius." The trouble with sacrifice is that other people start building on the empty space it leaves behind. I went to university in Vienna eventually, but not the program I wanted and not when I wanted. I had hoped to study history full-time and maybe go into research or archival work. Instead, I stayed closer to home for a year because our mother's back worsened, then transferred, then chose a more practical degree in communications because by that point practicality had colonized my imagination. If you spend enough of your life being told not to make things harder for the family, you start treating your own desires like extravagant imports. Sophie came to Vienna 2 years later. This is where the story starts to sound, even to me, less like bad luck and more like theft. She did not move because of me, officially. She got into an arts management course and wanted city life and culture and freedom and all the normal things girls from Graz want when they are 19 and tired of trains, church bells, and neighbors who know too much. But because I was already there, she moved in with me, temporarily. Temporary lasted 14 months. My flat at the time was tiny, a second-floor place in Neubau with a kitchen barely larger than a wardrobe and windows that looked onto another building's wall. But it was mine in the way first flats are sacred, inconvenient, badly insulated, and entirely connected to the fantasy that adulthood can be arranged through careful purchase of mismatched mugs and a lamp found on clearance. I had built that space inch by inch. I had rules. Shoes by the door, bills in a folder. No random guests after midnight on weeknights. If you finish the coffee, buy more coffee. Sophie entered that flat like weather enters a room through open windows. Suddenly people were always there. Danish exchange students, theater boys in scarves, women from her course with silver jewelry and opinions about documentary film, men named Luca and Emil and Jan who seemed to subsist entirely on cigarettes and improvised plans. The kitchen filled with wine bottles, scarves on chair backs, laughter, perfume, half-finished conversations. She made the flat feel alive in a way that I grudgingly envied. And then, slowly, she made it less mine. A frame print I had saved up for ended up, looking better, in her corner, so she moved it. My blue kettle disappeared to a friend's gathering and came back dented. People sat on my bed when I was not home because her room was too messy. Someone used my expensive shampoo and replaced it with supermarket rubbish. My mail got tucked under piles of flyers. She borrowed clothes and returned them scented with someone else's perfume and smoke. None of that is life theft. I know. It sounds like ordinary sibling flat-share friction. But it was the feeling underneath that mattered. Anywhere I made something stable, she arrived and turned it communal, charming, fluid, uncontained. And if I objected, I became cold, rigid, uptight, not fun. She did not need to overpower me. She only needed to make my boundaries look unfriendly. This pattern reached its first real crisis over a man, because of course it did. His name was Adrian. He was Romanian, doing postgraduate work in urban planning, and I met him at a lecture through one of my colleagues. He was not flashy or particularly effortless. He thought before speaking. He ironed shirts. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He had a face that changed completely when he laughed, which I discovered slowly because he did not laugh cheaply. He liked old stations, maps, and the smell of libraries after rain. He was exactly the kind of person my younger self had once imagined she might build a life beside: intelligent, careful, slightly difficult at first, deeply warm once known. We started seeing each other quietly, not because it was illicit, just because I didn't want family noise around it before I knew what it was. Sophie found out after maybe 6 weeks when she came home early and found him in the kitchen making coffee in one of my ridiculous oversized jumpers because he had got caught in the rain and I'd lent him something dry. She looked between us for half a second and then broke into this huge delighted grin. "Oh my God, Clara, you have a secret man." That was exactly how she said it. Secret man. As if at 24 I were a widow with a smuggled lover rather than a woman seeing someone for the first time in ages. At first she was lovely about him. Too lovely, maybe, but I ignored that because suspicion makes you look ugly even when you're right. She teased me, but kindly. She asked what he was like, whether I was happy, whether he knew how serious I could get when stressed. She offered to disappear one Friday so we could have dinner at the flat without her barging in between courses asking if she could borrow eyeliner. Adrian handled her well. Everyone did, at least at first. Sophie had a way of drawing men into sibling banter very quickly, half because she was naturally warm and half because she liked being central in every dynamic. I noticed small things that irritated me. She called him Professor as a joke. She remembered details he'd mentioned once and brought them up later. She offered him the better wine glass. She would drift into the kitchen while we were cooking and somehow remain there for 40 minutes without meaning to intrude. Again, each thing alone was nothing, but 100 nothings can make a pattern. One evening, Adrian and I had tickets to a chamber concert. I had been looking forward to it all week. I came home from work late and stressed, and Sophie was on the sofa with her ankle wrapped, saying she had twisted it on a stair and might need someone to go with her to urgent care if the swelling worsened. She was teary, dramatic, in pain but not screaming pain, more offended by pain. I said I would take her after the concert if it still looked bad. She stared at me as though I had suggested pushing her into the Danube. Adrian arrived 10 minutes later. She explained the situation before he had even taken off his coat. He immediately said maybe I should stay. Of course he did. He was decent. I said I thought she was all right for a couple of hours and asked if she wanted ice and ibuprofen. Then Sophie started crying. Not loud. Worse. Quiet, wounded tears, as if she had just discovered something fundamental and terrible about my character. I stayed. Adrian stayed too for a while, awkward and concerned, and by the end of the evening the concert was missed, Sophie's ankle was bandaged, and somehow I was the one apologizing to everyone. The next morning she was hobbling around making toast and saying, "You didn't have to cancel your whole night, honestly?" That sentence still makes me angry. A few months later, Adrian and I broke up, not because of one dramatic betrayal. Nothing cinematic, just erosion. I became tense every time he and Sophie occupied the same space. He accused me gently of being unfair to her. I accused him not gently of enjoying her attention. He said I saw competition where there wasn't any. I said that was easy for him to say because he was not the one who had spent her entire life being compared to her from opposite directions. He didn't understand what I meant. How could he? To him she was charming and I was becoming suspicious. One night after an argument he said, "I sometimes think you expect to be displaced." At the time I thought it was an accusation. Later I realized it was probably an observation. We ended things 3 weeks after that. Calmly, painfully, with too much politeness to make the grief clean. He said he cared about me, but everything felt heavy. I said everything always feels heavy when you are the only person trying to hold shape around someone who melts through every boundary and gets praised for warmth. He did not answer. That should have been the end of him in my story. It wasn't. About 9 months later, Sophie called me in tears saying she had met someone. It was serious. She didn't know how to tell me because the circumstances were horrible. And could I please just listen before reacting? Even before she said his name, my body knew. I felt it. There is a particular coldness that belongs only to dread you have rehearsed in private and prayed never to see in daylight. it was Adrian. Before anyone starts assuming timelines, no, she had not technically stolen him in the tabloid sense. They did not have an affair while he and I were together, at least not as far as I know, and not in the physical sense. According to both of them, they reconnected months after our breakup at an exhibition opening through mutual acquaintances, started talking, then unexpectedly found themselves spending time together. She cried while telling me that she never intended it, that she had fought it, that she hated herself, that she knew this would destroy me, that feelings are messy and adult life is complicated, and she could not lie to me because I was her sister. I said almost nothing during that call because rage that deep is too heavy to throw immediately. Then she said the sentence I will never forgive. I just think maybe he was always meant for this family. This family, not me. The family, as if I had merely been the first corridor he walked through on his way to her. I hung up. She came to the flat the next day, though. By then she was living elsewhere. She cried. She said she would end it if I asked. She said she loved me more. She said it had just happened. She said she and Adrian connected in ways she couldn't deny. She said she knew that sounded cruel. She said maybe the heartbreak with him had opened me to something else later, and maybe this would make sense in time. She was trying, in other words, to narrate my injury into meaning fast enough that she would not have to sit with being the one who caused it. I told her to leave. Our mother's reaction when she found out was somehow worse than the relationship itself. She sighed in that tired martyr way she had and said, "Well, nobody can help who they fall in love with. My father said it was awkward and unfortunate, but that I should not make permanent enemies over a modern complication." A modern complication? As if this were a tax bracket change. No one asked what it did to me that the one relationship I had tried to grow carefully had somehow ended up back in Sophie's orbit, where everything eventually seemed to go. Here is the shameful truth. Part of me was not even heartbroken about Adrian by then. Not primarily. I was humiliated. Confirmed. It felt like the universe had stamped A.P. Paravid on the story my family had always half written about us. Clara builds, Sophie inhabits. Clara opens the door. Sophie gets welcomed inside. I moved flats after that. Not just because of Sophie, but yes, because of her. I needed walls that had not absorbed her voice. I needed a kitchen no one else had turned into an annex of their personality. I needed to stop living in places where my own life felt like a waiting room for her next entrance. For a while, distance helped. She and Adrian became official. People adjusted. They even looked good together in photos, which was its own insult. He seemed looser with her, more relaxed, more public. With me, he had always been thoughtful, deliberate, like a man stepping carefully onto ice to see if it would bear weight. With her, he looked as though he had been invited to a party he hadn't known he deserved. If I sound cruel toward him, maybe I am. But I have made my peace with one thing. Men are not prizes, and I do not think she won because she ended up with him. That part stopped mattering before the rest did. What stayed was the old sensation of being mined. Anything good that grew near me seemed eventually available for communal redistribution, and somehow I was always the one expected to demonstrate maturity about it. Years passed. I built a career. A good one, actually, not the academic path I imagined at 17, but solid. Communications became cultural programming, then event strategy for museums and civic institutions. I discovered I was good at translating messy ideas into structures other people could execute. Useful again. Of course, if you train a skill under emotional duress, it can still become profitable. I worked hard, hard enough that eventually I was recruited by a respected cultural foundation in Vienna. Better pay, more responsibility, real visibility. For the first time in my life, I felt I had a room that was mine because I had earned it, not because someone else had left me in charge of it. My colleagues respected me. My boss, Ingrid, not my mother, a different Ingrid, trusted me. I traveled for work. I spoke on panels. I dressed better. I stopped apologizing for taking space in meetings. I began slowly to feel like maybe the life I had wanted had not been stolen so much as rerouted. And then Sophie came back into orbit again. By then, she and Adrian had moved to Munich for his work. We were not close, but we were in the kind of cautious family peace where everyone behaves as if the old wound is merely a scar and not something that still aches in damp weather. They came to holidays. I was civil. She was extra careful around me, which in some ways was worse than thoughtlessness because it made every interaction feel curated. Still, I could manage it. Parallel lives. Occasional contact. No intimacy. Then Adrian got an opportunity in Vienna. Sophie called me as if sharing delightful news, with all the oblivious optimism of someone who has mistaken surviving a wound for healing it. "We might be moving back," I said. "I see. It would be so lovely to be in the same city again." Again. Such a soft word for history that messy. They did move back. Not immediately into my district, thankfully, but close enough that family assumed proximity would fix what years had not. Our mother was thrilled. Our father pretended not to be emotional while immediately planning Sunday lunches we had never once successfully enjoyed in peace. Sophie began sending me more messages, tiny ones, a photo of snow on a balcony, a recommendation for a cafe, a question about where to find a good tailor. Harmless, deniable, persistent. And because life enjoys irony with almost erotic dedication, the Cultural Foundation, where I worked, announced an expansion into community arts partnerships and public engagement. One of the first major collaborations under discussion was with a private gallery network that had recently hired a new partnerships director. That director was Sophie. Yes. Really, I didn't know at first. We had not been in close enough contact for me to track her employment in detail. She had always floated through adjacent creative jobs, event coordination, donor relations, program support, curatorial admin, the sort of roles where charm, responsiveness, and social intelligence open doors faster than deep specialization. I don't say that with contempt, it's simply true. She was excellent at making people feel included. Institutions value that, and they should. But when her name appeared in a briefing document on my desk, attached to the line, lead external contact, I actually laughed out loud in my office because the alternative was putting my fist through glass. It felt absurd, like some deity had looked over my shoulder for 20 years and said, "You know what would be funny?" I went to my boss immediately and explained, in broad strokes, that there was a personal family conflict and asked whether someone else could manage that relationship. Not because I was incapable, but because I knew how quickly people like Sophie can turn, "We should keep things professional," into, "Why are you being so hostile?" My boss was sympathetic but practical. She said reassigning the whole partnership would create complications in optics. Could I perhaps keep a little distance and have junior staff handle day-to-day interactions? So that is what I tried to do. At first it was manageable. Meetings with others present, emails copied widely, nothing informal. Sophie was almost impeccably professional, which made me feel unreasonable for dreading every notification with her name on it. She was warm but not overly familiar, efficient, prepared, good at her job. Sometimes I caught colleagues smiling after calls with her and thought, of course they are. Then little things started happening. A proposal I had drafted informally in a strategy note appeared in her polished presentation 2 weeks later with the same phrasing, but no acknowledgement that it came from my team's early concept discussions. Not a crime. Ideas circulate. Still, I noticed an external donor thanked her in a meeting for that wonderful accessibility angle you championed, which had in fact come from one of my staff, Marguerite, after a 3-hour internal workshop I led. Sophie accepted the praise with a modest little laugh and said, "We all built it together." That phrase again, together, the solvent word. During a reception, one of the board members said to me, "Your sister is extraordinary. You must be proud seeing her thrive in this world too." In this world too. As if my work had opened a salon into which she now glided, carrying pieces of my language and tone like accessories. I know how paranoid this sounds, so let me be specific. She was not literally stealing documents off my laptop. She was doing something harder to accuse and easier to survive socially. She was arriving in spaces I had carved out through years of disciplined effort and immediately becoming the version of me those spaces found easier to celebrate. Warmer, more fluid, better at gratitude, at storytelling, at making important people feel lightly adored. Meanwhile, I remained the one who had built systems, named risks, corrected budgets, stayed late to ensure the thing actually happened. At one strategy dinner, a trustee's wife turned to Sophie and said, "You have such a gift for making culture feel human. Some people are brilliant behind the scenes, but people trust you instinctively." She meant it as a compliment. She did not know I was within earshot. Sophie glanced at me just briefly when she said it, not triumphant, not sorry. Something worse, aware. That look haunted me because it suggested she knew exactly what had always happened between us. Not consciously, maybe, not maliciously in the cartoon sense. But she knew that I made structures and she occupied them more elegantly. She knew that if we both entered the same room, I would be respected and she would be remembered. things escalated over a specific project. My foundation had spent almost a year developing a citywide program called Windows of Memory, centered on neighborhood archives, oral histories, and public installations in overlooked districts. It was the most personally meaningful work I had done in years because it touched something close to what I'd once wanted academically: history, memory, civic identity, not as dead files but as living public matter. I led the early strategy, the funding framework, the partner mapping. It was, without exaggeration, my project. Sophie's gallery network joined later as a visible external partner, providing exhibition space, sponsors, and media connections. Necessary, yes. Important, yes. But not origin work. As launch approached, the press materials began circulating. I read the draft announcement and saw her quoted first. Her name appeared before mine in the primary release. The framing positioned the gallery network as co-initiator rather than late-stage partner. My own contribution was compressed into a generic reference to institutional coordination. I emailed corrections immediately, calmly. Professionally, with tracked changes and dates. Sophie called within 5 minutes. "Hi," she said in that smooth voice people use when they're trying to keep you from setting something on fire. "I saw your notes." "Good. I think some of this is just communications flow, not personal." "It is personal if it misrepresents authorship." "Oh, Clara." That "oh, Clara." 2 syllables of softened dismissal, carrying 20 years inside them. I said, "No, don't do that. This project originated in our foundation. Your network came in after the second funding round. That should be reflected accurately." She exhaled. "Nobody is erasing you." "The draft literally does." "You're getting very activated." I nearly ended the call right there because nothing makes me feel more murderous than being told I am activated when I am in fact correct. Instead, I said, "The wording gets fixed." She said, "What can tweak it? But if we start making everyone territorial, we'll spook the donors." Territorial. Another lovely word for wants rightful credit. The wording was partly fixed, but not fully. Enough to prevent open scandal, not enough to restore accuracy. Launch day arrived. Press came. Speeches happened. Cameras loved Sophie. Cameras always loved Sophie. She gave an interview in which she referred to the program as "our dream many of us have been shaping for a long time." Many of us. There it was again. Communal fog laid over clear lines. The next morning, 2 newspapers used her quotes prominently and referred to her as a key driving force. My mention came in paragraph 9 of one article and not at all in the other. I went to the office and closed my door and stared at the wall for a full 10 minutes because I could feel something dangerous loosening in me. Not a tantrum. Worse. A lifetime of unspent fury beginning to find language. That evening our mother called, having of course seen the coverage because anything involving her daughters was still treated as family weather. She was delighted. She said how wonderful it was that you girls had done this together, how moving it must feel after everything, how proud she was that both her daughters were making names in the cultural world. I said, "Mum, I built this project." And she said lightly, "Of course, darling, but Sophie is so good at the public side, isn't she? You've always been the substance and she's always been the shine. Together you make a full person." I still remember standing barefoot in my kitchen tiles holding the phone so hard my hand cramped. Together you make a full person. If anyone ever asks me what sentence broke me, it was that one. Not because it was new, but because it was the first time I heard the whole family mythology stated plainly. I was not a complete self in their eyes. I was half of an ideal composite daughter, my diligence plus her charm, my endurance plus her softness, my planning plus her glow. And because they had never learned to value my half on its own, they did not understand why every time she stepped into my life and got adored for the visible part, something in me felt replaced. I don't remember exactly what I said after that. I know I cried, which I hate doing on the phone. I know my mother got defensive quickly because tears in our family were permitted only if they could be efficiently reassigned to the person who caused them. I know she said I was twisting a compliment into an accusation. I know I finally said, "You have spent my whole life loving me mainly for what I can carry and loving her mainly for how she makes you feel. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" Silence. Then she said in a smaller voice than I had ever heard from her, "That's not fair." Fair. There it was, the family religion. Not true or untrue. Fair or unfair to say aloud. I hung up. Sophie came to my flat 2 days later. This is apparently a pattern in my life, devastating confrontations in kitchens. She stood there in a charcoal coat with rain in her hair and looked genuinely tired. not theatrically wounded, not defensive yet, just worn. She said, "Mum told me what you said." I said, "Of course she did. Can I come in?" I almost said no. But some old reflex toward explanation overruled me, and I let her in. She sat at my table and wrapped both hands around a mug of tea she barely touched. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "I need you to know I never wanted to take anything from you." That sentence might have helped if I were 16. At 34, it only made me tired. I said, "Intent is not the same as effect." She nodded slowly, like someone receiving expert feedback in a workshop. "I know," she said, "but you talk about me like I've been plotting against you since childhood." I don't think you plotted. I think you floated, and every current in this family carried you somewhere soft while I was told to hold the furniture down. That landed, I saw it land. She said, "You think everything was easy for me because people found me lovable?" That is not what I said. Uh, it's what you mean. I considered that. Then I said, "No. I think being loved for softness probably trapped you too. But at least it was love." She flinched. For a second, I wanted to take it back because cruelty always feels hot before it feels hollow. But it was also true in the shape that mattered. She had been loved for being vulnerable, messy, magnetic. I had been valued for endurance. Those are not the same nourishment. Then she said something I genuinely was not prepared for. "Do you know what it was like growing up next to you?" I almost laughed. She kept going before I could respond. "You were the sun in every room where competence mattered. Teachers loved you. Dad respected you. Mom relied on you for everything. You knew how to do things. You knew what was expected. When you walked into a situation, everyone relaxed. When I walked in, I felt like the confetti cannon they gave to entertain themselves after the real work was done." I stared at her. It wasn't that I believed she had suffered more than I had. I didn't, but I had never once considered that from her angle. I might have looked like power. She said she spent years feeling ornamental next to me. That when adults called her charming, she heard unserious. When they praised my reliability, she heard important. She said I had no idea how often she felt stupid around me or how humiliating it was to be the sister people forgave rather than trusted. She said when Adrian first cared for her attention, it made her feel chosen on terms that were not childish. She said taking the job in the arts world after years in adjacent roles felt like finally becoming substantial, not just pleasant. If I had heard all this earlier, maybe something different could have happened between us. But timing matters in truth. Once damage calcifies, insight arrives like rain on stone. I said, "Do you understand that everything you're describing still ends with you stepping into places I built and being applauded for it?" Her eyes filled immediately. I didn't mean to. There it is again, because it's true. And it changes nothing. That is the terrible heart of it. People cling to innocence because they think lack of evil intent should erase impact. But you can devastate someone just by repeatedly treating their life as permeable to your needs. She cried quietly for a while. Then she said, "What do you want from me?" I answered too fast. "I want one thing in my life that you do not eventually walk into and become central in." She looked as though I had slapped her. I almost apologized. Instead, I stood up and opened the window because the room felt airless. She asked if I wanted her to resign from the partnership role. I said no immediately, partly because I didn't want that kind of theatrical sacrifice, and partly because by then it would have looked insane professionally. Also, and this is hard to admit, I didn't trust that if she did resign, everyone would not simply admire her nobility while privately finding me impossible. So I said no. I said what I wanted was distance. Real distance. Not performative family peace. Not her sending me little olive branches every few weeks so she could tell herself she'd tried. I said I needed her to stop assuming access to me was the default. I said I needed spaces where I was not continually being reminded that every boundary I draw gets interpreted as coldness, while every boundary she crosses gets interpreted as openness. She left looking wrecked. After that, we functioned in the same professional orbit with extreme politeness, meetings, emails. No personal contact unless absolutely necessary. Family events became logistical drills. Christmas was split. Our mother cried. Our father muttered something about stubborn daughters and the decline of resilience. I stopped attending most gatherings. Then came the inheritance issue, because apparently the universe wanted one final twist just to make sure no one could accuse this story of lacking thematic commitment. My grandmother, Ilse, our mother's mother, died last year. She was 91, severe, immaculate, and the only person in the family who ever looked directly at me and said, without embarrassment, "You carry too much for people." She was not warm exactly, but she was clear. I loved her for that. She left behind some money, not enormous but meaningful, and a small apartment in Graz that had been rented out for years. Everyone assumed the assets would be split simply between our mother and her brother, which would then eventually become a later generation issue. Instead, grandmother Ilse had left a separate letter of wishes stating that she wanted a portion of her savings set aside specifically for the granddaughter whose life has most often been reorganized around the needs of others. Yes, really? She did not name me in the letter because legally the structure ran through my mother, but no one in the room misunderstood. Not even for a second. My mother read the letter aloud at the solicitor's office and went white. My uncle looked fascinated. My father stared at the carpet. And Sophie, God, I can still see her face, looked like someone had gently but publicly removed a mask she hadn't known she was wearing. The sum was enough for a substantial down payment on a flat in Vienna. Not enough to retire on. Not a fortune. But enough to matter. Enough to feel like grandmother Ilse had reached from beyond the grave and said, I saw it. I cried in the tram home because it was the first time in my life an elder in my family had formally recognized that my role had cost me something. You might think that finally everything would balance. You would be wrong. My mother delayed the transfer for months. At first there were practical reasons. Probate, tax questions, administrative delays. Then, gradually, the language shifted. She said the wording in the letter was emotional, not binding. She said grandmother had been from another generation and saw things too starkly. She said it might be unfair to let one loaded sentence distort what should be an equal family process. She said Sophie was also struggling financially after some career change. She said maybe the money should support both daughters in different ways. There it was again, dilution in the name of peace. When I objected, she started crying. She said I was making bereavement transactional. She said I was using grandmother's final message as a weapon against my sister. My father said any good from the money would be poisoned if it became symbolic punishment. Sophie, to her slight credit, initially said very little. Then she sent me a message saying she didn't want anything that had been morally assigned to me and hoped Mum would honor it as intended. Do you know what made that worse? The moral elegance of it. Even when she said the right thing, she got to sound gracious. If she fought me, she was selfish. If she relinquished it nobly, she was generous. Meanwhile, I was still the one having to insist, again, that what was mine should not become communal because other people were more comfortable with my sacrifice than with my receipt. I hired a solicitor. I did not want to. The entire thing made me sick. But I had reached a point where every emotional appeal felt like a trapdoor beneath a concrete fact. The letter was not fully binding, but it was strong supporting evidence regarding intent. After enough legal correspondence, my mother relented. Barely. With damage. With resentment. With several speeches about how cold the whole thing had become. I bought my flat 6 months later. It is not large. It is not grand. It is a 2-room place with herringbone floors, high windows, and a kitchen big enough for a proper table. The first evening after signing, I sat on the floor with takeout and cried so hard I scared myself. Not from joy exactly, from the grief of how much fight it had taken to secure one uncontested corner of my life. I did not give Sophie the address. That decision is one half of why I am writing now. The other half is what happened last month. Our mother had minor surgery and needed help for a week afterward. Against my better judgment, I agreed to split the care rotation with Sophie because, despite everything, I am still apparently built in such a way that need drags me back toward service. We managed it, stiffly, politely, in shifts, like diplomats from hostile states sharing an airport lounge. On the third evening, our mother was asleep in her chair and the house was quiet except for the boiler making that old familiar clicking sound. Sophie and I ended up in the kitchen alone, which in this family is either neutral or catastrophic, never anything between. She looked around the room and said, "It's strange being here, isn't it?" And I said, "Not really. It still feels exactly the same." She smiled sadly and said, "That's the problem." I was too tired to deflect, so I said, "What do you want, Sophie?" She leaned against the counter for a moment, then said, "Adrian and I are separating." I wish I could tell you I was noble in that moment. I was not. I felt surprise, yes, but also an ugly flash of vindication so bright it embarrassed me internally. not because I wanted her suffering, but because some primitive part of me thought, finally, something she touched did not become automatically golden. I said, carefully, I'm sorry. She shook her head. No, you're not. No, I said after a pause. Not really, but I am sorry you're in pain. That honesty seemed to relieve her more than comfort would have. She told me it had been fraying for years. Different ambitions. Resentments. The move back to Vienna exposed old dynamics. Adrian felt perpetually cast as mediator between sisters, between family factions, between public warmth and private bitterness. She said he had grown quieter, then more distant, then one day simply said he felt as though every room in their life contained someone else's unfinished story. That line nearly knocked the breath out of me. Because yes, exactly, that is what it had always felt like to be around them. Then she said, I used to think you hated me because you thought I took things from you. Now I think maybe I kept running into your life because I didn't know how to build one that was fully mine. We stood there in the yellow kitchen light with our sleeping mother in the next room and 40 kilograms of history between us. I said, and what do you want me to do with that? She laughed once bitterly. Nothing. I'm not asking for absolution. That was, perhaps, the first mature sentence I had ever heard from her that had no hidden request inside it. Then she looked at me and said, I saw your flat. The room changed temperature. I said, very slowly, how? She told me one of our cousins had been helping a friend move in the same building and recognized my surname on the intercom. She had not gone in. She insisted. She had not told anyone else. She just knew now where I lived. And she wanted me to know she knew because she was tired of secrets turning into poison. I cannot explain how violated I felt by that, despite the accident of it. My flat was the first thing in my adult life that felt unshared, unentered, unserialized through family narrative. Just knowing she could picture the building made me irrationally furious. She saw it on my face immediately and started saying it wasn't like that. She wasn't planning to show up. She only told me because she thought honesty mattered, but I barely heard her because all I could think was, even here, even now, even by chance, she appears at the edges of what I have fought to keep separate. So I said the worst thing I have ever said to her. I said, please, just once in your life, find a door of your own instead of arriving at mine. She went completely still. Then she nodded once, like someone receiving a sentence already deserved. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. She just said, all right. She left 10 minutes later. Since then, our mother has recovered. Our father has called twice and hung up both times after I said hello, which is his preferred form of emotional expression. A few days ago, my mother finally said, with weary disapproval, I don't know why you girls insist on making everything a contest. A contest. That word made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on coffee. Because that is the family lie, isn't it? That two sisters somehow mutually entered a rivalry when in reality one child was trained to give and the other was trained to glow, and then everyone acted amazed when both turned out warped by it. Do I think Sophie consciously set out to steal my life? No. If I am being exact, what she stole was less tangible and maybe more devastating. First claim to sympathy, to narrative softness, to being interpreted generously, to walking into a room and not having to prove that wanting something did not make you difficult. She kept taking up positions in my orbit where, by history or personality or family chemistry, she would inevitably become the more lovable version of my own story. And yet I know, because I am not stupid and because age has blunted some self-righteousness, that she was also trapped. People who are loved for ease become terrified of causing discomfort. People who survive by charm start borrowing identity from whatever room welcomes them. Maybe she moved into my spaces because I had solidity and she had spent her life performing warmth. Maybe she envied the exact things in me that I thought no one valued. Maybe we each spent decades looking through the other sister's window, convinced the better inheritance was on the other side. But insight is not repair. Understanding the architecture of the fire does not rebuild the house. I am tired of being told to see nuance when nuance has so often been the solvent used to dissolve my right to anger. Tired of family peace that always seems to cost me more than anyone else. Tired of being the one expected to metabolize hurt into perspective before everyone feels uncomfortable. Tired of wondering whether every achievement of mine becomes safer, more acceptable once it is passed through Sophie's softer hands. Mostly I am tired of how childish it sounds to say it plainly. My sister stole my life. It sounds juvenile, like something shouted by a teenager because her sibling borrowed eyeliner or kissed the wrong boy at a party. But sometimes adulthood is just childhood patterns wearing better coats. Sometimes the theft is not of objects but of authorship. Of being able to say this happened to me, this matters, this is mine, without someone more charming drifting in and making the same territory feel collectively owned. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if there will be reconciliation in the noble cinematic sense. I don't know if I even want it, or if wanting it would just mean volunteering once more to be the sensible one who builds the bridge and then watches everyone praise the other person for crossing it beautifully. What I do know is this: I bought a flat with money my grandmother meant for me because she saw the ledger of our family more clearly than the rest of us did. I put my own name on the doorbell. I painted the bedroom a color no one else chose. I bought heavy curtains and a table that does not wobble. I host no one unless I want to. I do not leave spare keys with relatives. The coffee is where I put it. The books stay on the shelves where I arrange them. When I come home, there is no sense of waiting to find out who has rearranged the atmosphere. Maybe that is not a whole life. But it is a beginning that no one handed me, and for once no one gets to call it ours. Story 5. I ended my engagement after my fiancée said she never got to have her hoe phase. I'm writing this because everyone in my life has an opinion, and somehow I've gone from being a man who quietly called off his wedding to being painted as controlling, insecure, dramatic, cold, and unable to handle one honest conversation. Maybe I am one of those things. Maybe I'm all of them. But I need to get this out somewhere because the version of events making the rounds in our friend group makes me sound like I dumped my fiancée for saying one stupid sentence, and that is not what happened. I'm from Utrecht in the Netherlands. I'm 29. My ex-fiancée, Saskia, is 28 and from Groningen. We met in Amsterdam 6 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. I had gone only because my friend Leonard said there would be good wine and no clubbing afterward, which was exactly my speed even at 23. Saskia showed up late, slightly out of breath, in a green coat and with rain in her hair, apologizing to everyone in that way effortlessly charming people do, where even their lateness somehow feels like a gift to the room. She sat across from me at first. Then people shifted for dessert, and suddenly she was next to me, elbows almost touching mine, asking if I always looked so serious or if I had simply decided in advance that everyone at the table was an idiot. That was Saskia. She could say something rude and make it sound flirtatious. She could tease without sounding cruel. She had this dry, clever sense of humor that made you feel singled out in the best way. When she laughed properly, not the polite little social laugh, but the real one. She scrunched her nose and touched whoever was nearest like she had to physically anchor herself in the moment. We started dating slowly, which made it feel more solid. We weren't one of those couples who crash together in 3 weeks and get matching tattoos by month 3. We took trains to see each other. We wandered through bookshops in Harlem and markets in Rotterdam. We drank bad coffee in train stations and better wine in tiny places where the menus were written on chalkboards. She worked in communications for a museum. I'm a civil engineer. She liked everything that moved. I liked everything that held. Looking back, that probably says a lot. At the beginning, one of the things I loved most about Saskia was how open she seemed. She talked about uncomfortable things directly. Family issues, insecurities, money, sex, fear, ambition. Nothing seemed off limits. I grew up in a household where feelings were treated like plumbing problems. If something leaked, you fixed it quietly and preferably alone. My father, Peter, is kind but reserved. My mother, Elise, has a way of smoothing over tension before it ever reaches language. We were not a say-everything family. Saskia was. It felt healthy, mature, modern. When we'd been together about 8 months, we had our first serious conversation about past relationships. We were in her flat in Deep Peep, sitting on the floor, because she hadn't gotten around to buying a proper sofa yet. She asked me how many people I'd slept with. I told her. She told me I remember feeling a small, ugly flicker of jealousy, not because her number was especially high, it wasn't, but because each name reminded me she had existed before me in ways I couldn't control or compete with. I asked if she'd ever had a wild period. She laughed and said, "Not really. I spent most of university being responsible and in long relationships. Very tragic. I was basically 40 at 19. Then she added, "Maybe that's why I'm fun now. At the time, it was a joke, or I thought it was. Our relationship was not perfect, but it was good." genuinely good. We traveled well together, which I've always believed matters more than romance in the abstract. We did Edinburgh in November with one broken umbrella and no plans. We did Prague in August and got lost daily and never fought once. During lockdown, we spent so much time in my apartment in Utrecht that when restrictions lifted, we realized she basically lived with me already. It was not some turbulent, on again, off again thing. It was stable. It had weight. We knew each other's rhythms. I knew she hated coriander, that she always read the ending of crime novels too early because suspense made her anxious, that she cried at videos of old dogs getting adopted, that she loved the smell of rain but hated being caught in it. She knew I ironed shirts the night before meetings because it calmed me down, that I took my coffee too hot and my showers too cold, that when I got overwhelmed I went silent rather than angry. She met my parents in Amersfoort at Christmas and charmed them in under 20 minutes. My mother still talks about the lemon tart Saskia brought as if it came from the hands of God. I met her family in Groningen the following spring. Her father, Henk, was loud and warm and opinionated about football. Her mother, Marieke, had eyes that missed nothing. Her younger brother, Joris, kept pretending to interrogate me like I was joining the intelligence service. It all felt easy. It felt like my life was opening instead of narrowing. When people say, there must have been signs, I don't know how to answer. Because yes, now I can make a museum out of the signs. I can put each one under glass and label it. But when you are inside a relationship, signs don't arrive as mornings, they arrive as moments, throwaway comments, bad moods, new interests, tiny evasions, human mess. And if you love someone, you interpret them in the kindest way possible until kindness turns into self-deception. The first thing that started bothering me was not cheating or anything close to it. It was her increasing obsession with the idea that we had become too settled. That phrase started appearing in conversation around the 4-year mark. We had moved into a bigger flat together near Lombok and had started talking seriously about marriage, maybe children in a few years, maybe buying a place if the market ever stopped behaving like a cruel joke. Instead of being excited by that, Saskia seemed both drawn to it and irritated by it. She'd talk about paint colors and guest lists one week, then the next she'd say something like, "Do you ever worry we're becoming one of those couples who only discuss groceries and boiler maintenance?" I would laugh and say every adult conversation eventually comes down to groceries and boiler maintenance. She didn't laugh back. Then came the social changes, more nights out with colleagues, more emphasis on girls' weekends, more interest in posting photos which had never been her thing before, more comments about aging, which confused me because she was 27 and objectively beautiful. She started following influencers who made entire personalities out of being unattached, glamorous, sexually liberated, and permanently halfway to Ibiza. I know how that sounds. I'm not one of those men who thinks a woman putting on red lipstick or going dancing is a political act against monogamy. I'm not threatened by fun. But there was a shift, and I felt it long before I understood it. She started saying things like, "I love you, but sometimes I wonder who I'd be if we hadn't met so young." Or, "Do you ever think it's strange that we might never date anyone else again?" Once, after 2 glasses of wine at a dinner in Antwerp with our friends, she looked around at the city center lit up at night and said, "Imagine being single here. Absolute chaos." I asked, "Good chaos or bad chaos?" She smiled in that unreadable way of hers and said, "Depends who's asking." I should have pressed harder. I know that now. But I didn't want to be the paranoid fiancé interrogating every stray remark. I trusted her. More than that, I trusted us. I thought whatever existential wobble she was having was normal. People panic before milestones. People mourn alternate selves. People wonder about roads not taken. That doesn't mean they want to torch the road they're actually on. When I proposed, it was in Bruges in early December. Not in some overproduced public spectacle. Just the 2 of us after dinner, walking by the canal with our collars turned up against the cold. I had the ring in my coat pocket for 2 days because I kept losing my nerve and then hating myself for being nervous when I knew I wanted to spend my life with her. I finally did it beside a bridge with almost no one around. She cried. Properly cried. She said yes before I'd even finished speaking. For months afterward, she was radiant. That's the only word for it. We called family. We celebrated in Antwerp on the way home. Her mother cried. My father shook my hand like I just signed a peace treaty. Friends bought us drinks and sent venue recommendations and made stupid jokes about stag nights. If you had asked me then, I would have said I was the luckiest man in the world. But somewhere in the year of being engaged, the current underneath everything changed. Wedding planning brought out things I hadn't seen clearly before. Saskia became strangely split. Hyper invested in superficial details, detached from emotional ones. She cared intensely about the photographer, the music, the flowers, the dress, the seating chart aesthetics, the vibe, the energy of the venue. But if I tried to talk about the marriage itself, how we'd handle finances, whether we wanted kids in 2 years or 4, where we'd settle long term, she'd become vague or irritated. You always make things so serious, she told me once while we were reviewing venue options in our kitchen. It is serious, I said. It's a wedding. It's a party, she said. It's both. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean? But I didn't. Not really. Around that time, a new friend from work became important in her life. Her name was Chiara, Italian, living in Amsterdam for years, loud and magnetic, and permanently in some low-level state of flirtation with the entire world. I met her twice. She wasn't rude to me, but she gave off a sort of amused anthropologist energy, as if she were observing a quaint domestic species in a controlled environment. Saskia started quoting her a lot. Chiara says you only really know yourself if you've spent proper time single. Chiara says women get trapped in respectable lives before they've had any fun. Chiara says half the people getting married are just afraid no one else will love them. I'd joke back, Chiara sounds exhausting. Saskia would say, Chiara sounds honest. There was also met one of Saskia's oldest friends from university who had recently gone through a messy breakup and was suddenly reinventing herself every other month. New hair, new tattoos, new city breaks, new men, new philosophies. Met spoke about heartbreak the way some people speak about ayahuasca, as if it had blasted her into a higher state of authenticity. She started spending more time with Saskia too. I don't blame friends for everything. I'm not 12. People make their own choices. But it matters who is in your ear when you're already restless. One night about 8 months before the wedding, Saskia came home late from drinks with Chiara and Met. I was half asleep on the sofa with a documentary still playing. She stood in the doorway, kicked off her heels, and said, "Can I ask you something without you reacting badly?" That sentence alone should be illegal. I muted the television and sat up. Depends what it is. She laughed, but there was tension in it. No, seriously? Hypothetically? I remember every second of this, which is unfortunate because I'd pay good money to forget it. She came into the room and sat on the armchair opposite me, tucking one leg underneath herself. She smelled like wine and winter air and the perfume she wore when she wanted to feel invincible. "Do you think it's bad," she said slowly, "for someone to get married if they feel like they never really had the chance to be wild?" I stared at her. "What does wild mean?" She shrugged. "I don't know." "Single? Free, messy, stupid, desired, young. You are young." "You know what I mean, no." I said more sharply than I intended. "I actually don't." She looked annoyed then, as though I were deliberately misunderstanding. "I just mean some people spend their whole 20s being sensible and committed, and then suddenly they're nearly 30 and that's it. Their whole life path is decided." I said, "If you don't want this life, you can say that plainly." She leaned back and crossed her arms. "Why do you always do that?" "Do what?" "Make everything extreme." I laughed once, not because it was funny, because I could feel something ugly beginning to rise in my chest and didn't know what else to do with it. "You're asking me if it's bad to get married when you wish you'd had more time being young and single and desired. How exactly would you like me to interpret that?" "It's just a thought," she snapped. "Well, it's a cruel thought to bring to your fiancé at midnight." She got quiet after that. Then she said softer, "I'm being honest with you. Isn't that better than lying?" That line stayed with me because people use honesty as if it is automatically virtuous, regardless of what they're doing with it. A knife can be honest too. That doesn't make it kind. I asked her outright if she was unhappy with me. She said no. I asked if she wanted to postpone the wedding. She said no. I asked if there was someone else. She looked genuinely offended and said absolutely not. Then she moved next to me on the sofa, put her hand on my arm and said, "I love you. I'm just scared." That's allowed. I wanted to believe that, so I did. For a while, things improved. We had one of those intense relationship resets where you both suddenly become more attentive because you've glimpsed the cliff edge. We took a trip to Lake Blood in Slovenia. We left our phones in the hotel room half the time. We swam, hiked, drank too much local wine, had the kind of sex that makes you think maybe every problem was just stress and poor timing. She seemed present again. Warm, certain. When we came home, she suggested we do premarital counseling, not because anything was wrong, she said, but because healthy people do maintenance too. I was impressed by that, relieved even. We did 6 sessions with a therapist named Anja in Amsterdam. Most of it was useful. Communication styles, conflict avoidance, expectations, family patterns. Saskia was articulate in those sessions. Insightful. She talked about fearing stagnation, about needing spontaneity, about sometimes associating commitment with loss of self. Anja asked if she associated monogamy with loss of freedom. Saskia hesitated and said, sometimes, yes. But I think that's more about me than about us. I should have paid more attention to the sometimes. Still, by the end of counseling, Anja seemed to think we were solid. We left one session holding hands and laughing about how couples therapy made everyone sound like they were negotiating a hostage release. I remember thinking, we're doing everything right, we're communicating, we're confronting fears, we're not sleepwalking into marriage, we're building it carefully. I had no idea that Saskia had started framing the entire relationship as an obstacle she hadn't yet decided whether to climb over or detonate. The worst part is that the final conversation didn't happen because I snooped. It didn't happen because I caught her cheating. It didn't happen because of lipstick on a glass or strange receipts or suspicious late-night messages. It happened because she chose very calmly to tell me exactly who she was and what she wanted, and for once I actually listened. It was 6 weeks before the wedding. We had gone to dinner in Brussels because I had a work meeting there that Friday, and she suggested coming along so we could make a weekend of it. We stayed in a small hotel near Ixelles. Dinner was lovely on paper. Candlelight, good food, the kind of place where people celebrate anniversaries and engagements and pretend they're not eavesdropping on the tables beside them. Saskia had been unusually quiet all evening. Not upset, just inward. Tired, looking in a way makeup can't hide. I asked twice if she was all right. Twice she said yes. Then, after the main course, while I was saying something forgettable about a colleague of mine, she put down her glass and said, I think we need to have a hard conversation. There are phrases that instantly make the room colder. That was one of them, I said. Okay? She looked at me with an expression I still can't fully decode. Sadness, yes, but also relief. Almost anticipation. I've been trying very hard, she said, to be the person who can do this without doubt. I felt myself go completely still. Do what? Get married. I remember hearing the clatter of cutlery from another table and being absurdly aware that someone nearby was laughing. I asked, Are you saying you don't want to marry me? She shook her head immediately. It's not that simple. It actually is that simple. No, it isn't, she said. Because I do love you. I do want you. I don't know if I can promise forever when I feel like I skipped an entire phase of life and now it's haunting me. I said nothing because some part of me already knew what was coming and wanted to delay hearing it by even 3 seconds. She went on, I never got to have that time where you're just selfish and free and you make mistakes and you flirt and you sleep with people and find yourself. I went from one serious relationship to another and now I'm supposed to become someone's wife before I've even been reckless once. That should have been enough. It was already enough. But she kept talking. I know it sounds shallow, she said. And I know there's an ugly word for it. Kiara calls it a hoe phase, which is vulgar. But honestly, that's kind of what it is. I never got to have one. And part of me feels like if I never do, I'll resent you. Or resent the marriage. Or wake up at 35 and blow up our life anyway. There it was. Clean. Direct. Clinical. Almost. My future reduced to a warning label. The odd thing is I didn't explode. People imagine rage in moments like that, glasses thrown, accusations, dramatic exits. I just felt myself detach, like my body had decided this was survivable only if I stepped half outside of it. I asked, Are you asking for an open relationship? She said, No. I asked, Are you asking to postpone the wedding? She hesitated. Maybe. I asked, Are you asking for a break so you can sleep with other people and then come back? She looked down. That was the answer. She said very softly, maybe if it was agreed, maybe if it was temporary, maybe if we were honest. I laughed then, but not nicely. Ours. Her eyes flashed. Don't do that.
Make me sound disgusting.
I'm not making you sound anything, Saskia. You are sitting here telling me that weeks before our wedding you want to press pause on our relationship so you can go get railed by strangers in the name of self-discovery. A woman at the next table glanced over. I lowered my voice immediately, but the damage was done. Saskia went white with anger. You are being cruel, she hissed. I am being accurate. No, you're being humiliating because you're hurt. Yes, I said. I am hurt. Brilliant observation. She leaned forward. I'm trying to prevent something worse later. I'm trying to be honest before vows are involved. I said, you think the nobility here is that you told me before legally binding us to each other. That matters, yes. I looked at her and something in me settled. Not healed, settled. Like sediment dropping in dirty water, I asked one last question. If I said no, absolutely not, no break, no sleeping with other people, no postponement to go find yourself in other men's beds, would you still marry me without resentment? She didn't answer quickly enough. That was it. That was the death. Silence can be an answer so loud it cracks bone. I put my napkin on the table and said, then there isn't a wedding anymore? She stared at me. Don't say that in anger! I'm not angry. I'm done. You can't decide that in 1 minute. I can decide that instantly, I said, because I know exactly what I'm not signing up for. I am not standing at an altar with someone who sees fidelity as a missed opportunity. She started crying then, not loudly, but enough that people noticed. I hated that, not because I lacked sympathy, but because public tears immediately cast roles. She became the fragile, devastated woman. I became the rigid man across from her. She said, you're throwing away 6 years because I told you the truth. And I said, no. I'm refusing to throw away my self-respect because you did. That was probably the harshest thing I said all night, and it still doesn't feel untrue. We left separately. She stayed at the hotel. I booked the earliest train I could and went back to Utrecht the next morning with no sleep and a suitcase full of clothes that suddenly felt like evidence from another man's life. When I got home, I sat in our flat for about an hour without moving. Her mug was in the sink. Her scarf was over the dining chair. There were sample wedding invitations on the sideboard. A florist brochure on the counter. 2 lives everywhere I looked, and suddenly only one person willing to defend them. I called my sister, Maud, first. She lives in The Hague and has the kind of practical, emotional intelligence I deeply envy. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, do you want comfort or honesty? I said, please don't say honesty. I might throw the phone. She actually laughed, which helped. Then she said, my comfort is that you're not insane. My honesty is that if you marry her after this, you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for the sequel. That sentence saved me more than she knows. I called my parents next. My mother cried immediately, not for the wedding, but for me, which somehow made it worse. My father was very quiet. Then he said, come here for dinner tonight. That was his version of I love you. I'm furious for you. And you will not be alone. Saskia came back the following evening. I had packed a bag for myself but ended up not needing it because she walked in, saw her things stacked neatly in the guest room, and understood what I had decided. We had what I'll call our administrative breakup first, the sort of conversation that feels obscene because logistics are intruding on heartbreak, venue deposit, guest notices, furniture, lease, whether to tell people together or separately, whether to say postponed or canceled. I said canceled. She flinched. Then came the emotional part. She kept insisting she had not cheated, as if that was the central moral question. Maybe for her it was. For me it wasn't. I believed her when she said she hadn't physically cheated. I still mostly believe that. But fidelity is not only what you do with your body. It is what you protect in your mind. What you feed, what you rehearse, what you keep sacred instead of framing as deprivation. She said she had hoped I would understand that this was about identity, not sex. I said identity doesn't get a free moral pass just because it's wrapped in therapy language. She said monogamy shouldn't feel like prison. I said, then don't promise it. She said I was punishing her for being vulnerable. I said no, I was responding to what she was vulnerable about. She said lots of people have doubts before marriage. I said lots of people don't ask for a sanctioned intermission to go audition other options. At one point, she shouted, why is your pride more important than our relationship? And I answered, very quietly, because without self-respect, this relationship would only be me volunteering to be your backup plan. That made her cry again. She sat on the guest room bed, head in her hands, saying, that's not what you are. But it was exactly what I would have become if I stayed. The safe man, the stable one, the emotional home base while she figured herself out, the person expected to wait nobly, proving the depth of his love by enduring humiliation with maturity. I loved Saskia. I might even have still loved her in that moment. But love offered on those terms is poison. The next few weeks were ugly in all the ordinary ways. Calls to vendors, the humiliating need to inform extended family, friends dividing themselves into camps of sympathy and discomfort, mutual friends texting versions of, "I'm so sorry, but I don't want to get involved," which of course means they are already involved. Saskia moved in temporarily with her friend Noor in Amsterdam. I stayed in the flat because I couldn't bear the idea of being the one displaced from a life I had not blown apart. We told most people together at first, via a careful message after much thought, we've decided to end our engagement and relationship. We ask for privacy and kindness. Privacy lasted about 11 minutes. Within days, I heard through Leonard that some version of the story had already spread. Saskia had expressed normal premarital doubts, and I had overreacted because I'm emotionally rigid. Another version said she merely asked whether we were moving too fast. Another said I couldn't tolerate nuance. Another, my personal favorite, implied I was upset because she admitted she'd had fantasies about other people, which apparently all adults have, and only an insecure man would find threatening. The word, phase, had either been omitted or transformed into a discussion about freedom. That's how language works when people want to preserve their self-image. They sand the furniture until it looks harmless. Then came the calls from people who meant well and still managed to make everything worse. Met called me one evening after too much wine and said, "I think you're making a mistake because Saskia was being brave. Most women just marry the safe guy and cheat later." I said, "That is not a compelling sales pitch." She sighed dramatically and told me I was seeing sexuality as betrayal because society teaches men to own women. I told her I did not own Saskia, which was exactly why she was free to leave if monogamy with me felt like a tragic waste of youth. Kiara never called me directly, but I heard from Saskia later that she thought I was provincial in mindset, which is funny given that I've never met anyone more intellectually provincial than people who mistake impulsiveness for enlightenment. Not everyone took her side. My sister Maud despised the entire framing from the beginning. She said, "People are acting like you denied her a scholarship abroad. She wanted a hall pass before the wedding." The fact that she used trendy language doesn't make it deep. Lennart, who is usually annoyingly diplomatic, told me flat out, "If you take her back after this, I will support you because you're my friend, but I will also assume you've had a head injury." My mother was gentler. She said, "I don't think Saskia is evil. I think she is selfish and confused. Those are dangerous enough." My father, after a long silence over coffee one Sunday, said, "When your mother married me, I never once felt she was sacrificing better options." That one nearly broke me. Because that was exactly it. I didn't need perfection. I didn't need a woman untouched by doubt or temptation or curiosity. I needed to know that when she looked at a future with me, she saw a chosen life, not a closed door. About a month after the breakup Saskia asked to meet, I almost refused. But some part of me wanted closure, or maybe I wanted evidence that leaving had been the right thing. So we met in Leiden, neutral ground, at a cafe near the canal where no one knew us. She looked thinner, tired, less polished. She had cut her hair shorter, which on her somehow made her look both older and younger. For the first 20 minutes, we talked like people diffusing a bomb with oven mitts. Work. Sleep. The least timeline. Whether she wanted the blue armchair. Then she looked at me directly and said, "I made it sound uglier than I meant it." I said, "No. You made it sound exactly how it was." She closed her eyes for a second. "I wasn't saying I wanted random men more than I wanted you, but you wanted the option enough to risk losing me. That's not the same." "It is to me?" She started crying again, quieter this time. "I thought if we loved each other enough, we could survive an honest conversation." I said, "We might have, if honesty had been about fear. But it was also about desire, about wanting to keep me while exploring whether other lives felt more exciting." She said, "I didn't want to lose you." And I said, "That's the problem. You wanted both." She didn't deny it. Then she said something that still turns in my head sometimes at 3 in the morning. She said, "I think I wanted to know I still could, not that she needed to. Not even that she definitely would, just that she still could, that she still had access to a version of herself unclaimed, unbound, wanted by a roomful of strangers. I think for Saskia, it was never only about sex. It was about keeping every identity unlocked, about refusing to let life become singular. But adulthood is singular. Love is singular in 1,000 daily ways. To choose is to lose alternatives. That's not tragedy. That's structure. I asked her, and what if I had said yes? What then? She looked ashamed. I don't know. No, I said. Really think about it. What then? How many men would have made you feel free enough? How many weekends? How many stories? At what point would you come back and declare yourself complete? She said nothing, because there is no measurable endpoint to hunger when the hunger itself is existential. You cannot fuck your way into certainty about mortality, aging, identity, time, freedom, all the things she was really afraid of. She asked if there was any chance for us in the future. I said no. That was the first time I saw true devastation on her face, not because I was cruel, but because until then, I think she genuinely believed there might be a route back if she explained herself elegantly enough. Maybe she thought I would admire her honesty eventually. Maybe she thought I'd wait. Maybe she thought the life we built would remain on a shelf while she inspected the lives she hadn't lived. But I am not an unattended coat in a restaurant. After that, things quieted externally, but internally I was a wreck for months. People assume ending an engagement because of a clear boundary violation must feel empowering. Sometimes it did. Mostly it felt like grief with administrative paperwork attached. I missed her terribly. That's the part people who want simple heroes and villains never understand. Leaving someone can be the right decision and still feel like amputation. I missed stupid things, the way she sang wrong lyrics confidently, the notes she left on the fridge, how she stole my socks and denied it, the exact pressure of her hand on the back of my neck when she passed behind my chair. I missed having someone to tell useless details to. I missed planning. I missed the future as an object I could hold. And because pain loves humiliation, part of me also imagined what she was doing. Was she out with Kiara in some bar in Amsterdam, finally tasting the glamorous chaos she thought she'd missed? Was she flirting? Kissing strangers? Sleeping with them? Was she comparing them to me? Was she disappointed? Thrilled? Was she relieved not to be the woman who settled down too early? I had to live with the fact that even if she regretted everything instantly, I still couldn't go back. And that is a lonely kind of discipline. A few months later, Leonard ran into Joris, Saskia's brother, at an event in Rotterdam. Apparently Joris told him after enough beers that their parents thought Saskia had made the most expensive emotional mistake of her life. Marique had apparently said, "You do not throw away a trustworthy man because you are bored by your own thoughts." I found that both brutal and weirdly comforting. I also heard, through an unfortunate chain of mutual acquaintances, that Saskia did eventually start doing exactly what she talked about. Dating app whirlwind, nights out, weekends away, a short thing with a French photographer in Brussels, a longer thing with a divorced man from Harlem that ended badly because he was emotionally unavailable, which, if I'm being honest, nearly made me choke on my coffee when I heard it. I don't say that to mock her pain. Not entirely. But there is something grotesque about setting fire to a stable home because you want adventure, then acting wounded when adventure turns out to have weather. I have tried very hard not to become bitter. Bitterness is seductive because it makes you feel armored, but it also keeps you married to the wound. So I've done the responsible things. Therapy, running, fewer drinks, more sleep, time with my family, time alone without dramatizing it. I even went on a few dates, though the first one felt like being interviewed for a role I had not prepared for. What lingers most is not anger. It's the damage to my sense of mutual reality. For years I thought Saskia and I were building the same thing at roughly the same pace with roughly the same understanding of what commitment meant. Apparently we were not. Apparently I was building a home while she was still checking the emergency exits. That's the part that makes me recoil when people say I should have shown more flexibility. Flexibility toward what? Toward being told I was deeply loved, but not quite enough to outweigh hypothetical strangers. Toward being asked to absorb uncertainty so she could investigate whether commitment was really for her. Toward tying my dignity to the hope that a temporary excursion into novelty would somehow make her appreciate me more. I know there are couples who survive things like that, open arrangements, breaks, detours, reconfigurations. I'm not condemning all of them, but that is not me. I do not want to be chosen after market testing. I do not want vows from someone who needed field research first. I do not want faithfulness that feels like a negotiated surrender. What frustrates me most is how often men are told that having standards about this is insecurity. If a woman says, I need to explore sexually before I commit forever, everyone rushes to frame it as brave self-knowledge. And maybe sometimes it is. But the other person still gets to say, then you are not the partner for me. That is not oppression. That is discernment. I didn't end the engagement because Saskia had thoughts. I ended it because those thoughts had matured into a proposal, one that required me to shrink myself into patience while she experimented with whether I was truly what she wanted. I ended it because when given the choice between protecting our relationship and protecting her access to other possibilities, she hesitated. I ended it because love without reverence is eventually just appetite with nostalgia. If I sound dramatic, fine. I lost a 6-year relationship, a fiancé, a home as I knew it, and an entire imagined future because the woman I loved looked at marriage and saw not devotion, but the closing bell on a party she worried she'd never properly attended. I think I'm allowed a little drama. For what it's worth, I do not hate Saskia. I think she is intelligent, emotionally articulate, often kind, and catastrophically vulnerable to glamorizing dissatisfaction. I think she confused freedom with endless option value. I think she mistook restlessness for truth. I think she wanted certainty without sacrifice, adulthood without exclusion, devotion without finality. A lot of people do. Most just don't say it out loud until much later when children and mortgages are involved. In that sense, yes, maybe she did me a favor. But let's not romanticize the favor. She didn't nobly release me because she respected me too much to betray me. She brought me a proposition designed to preserve her emotional security while she explored her unfinished fantasies. She wanted the comfort of being loved and the thrill of being unbound. She wanted me waiting at the harbor while she tested the sea. And I said no. I still think about the wedding that never happened, the venue in Harlem we almost booked, the navy suit I never wore, my mother's face during the ceremony I canceled, the speech Leonard never gave, the dance floor that never filled. Sometimes grief comes not for what existed, but for the version of the future that had already become emotionally real. There are ghosts attached to canceled plans. But if I picture the alternate timeline where I stayed, it gets dark very quickly. Maybe she would have gone and come back. Maybe she'd have cried and said now she knew for sure. Maybe I would have married her with a smile everyone called mature. And then what? Every argument would have had a basement. Every late night would echo. Every moment of distance would ask the same question: is she with me because she chooses me today or because she already did the comparison shopping? I could not live like that. So here I am, single, 30 soon, slightly more cynical, definitely less stupid, still grieving, still angry in weird pockets, still capable of missing someone I should not take back, but also, beneath all that, quietly relieved. Relieved I found out before vows. Relieved I was not pliable enough to call humiliation growth. Relieved I loved myself just enough to walk away when the woman I loved asked me to wait while she measured the world against me.